Hey Internet, hey YouTube, this is Nate. You can also call me Nathan, but please never call me Nathaniel, and welcome to part 2 of Nate's Guide to Every Original Monster Train Champion. So in part 1, if you haven't already watched it, the link is in the description. We covered already the Hornbreaker Prince and the Sentient, and in this part we're going to cover Tethys, Titansbane, Penumbra, and Rector Flicker. So yeah, if you aren't aware of the structure, go ahead and watch part 1. You can see exactly how the guide is set up. And without further ado, quick reminder again, if you have not yet already, subscribe to the channel if you're liking this kind of content, and if you've already subscribed, thank you, appreciate it, and hope you're enjoying the videos. Alright, Stygian Guard, Tethys Titansbane. Tethys' lore. Do not be fooled by her harmless demeanor. Tethys was the first to agree to the containment of the Titan for our Covenant's sake. She has since become the most revered member of the Stygian Guard and my most helpful supporter in the defense of Hell. So from a design perspective, as with all of the Stygian Guard, has a very strong underwater theme. Not really sure what to compare it to. Somewhere between like a Murloc from Warcraft and some other kind of fish. But in general, this design is like this more spellcasty or underwater witch type theme, right? So let's see how that factors into gameplay. So we have 3 different upgrade paths. Chillwind, which is a frost-oriented upgrade path. So as you upgrade, you get stronger and stronger damage and frostbite application to the enemies that are struck. With Conduit, it's more of spell enablement. So each level of Conduit reduces the spell costs for damage spells. And then Handheld Totem is a sweep, and as well applying spell weakness, so it's more of like a big bursty spell-oriented upgrade path with a little bit of tankiness, not so much damage there. So yeah, I think all of them kind of fit this witch theme. I would probably say Chillwind and Handheld Totem both thematically seem to work a little bit better as the idea of like this big dangerous witch casting big brutal spells and so on, but Conduit also kind of fits that as well. But hey, enough about lore. Let's jump into the review of or guide for Chillwind. So Chillwind starts off increasing the damage to 15, still with 3 health, and with text strike, apply frostbite 10 to the attacked unit. That then upgrades to double the frostbite and double the attack damage at rank 2, and doubles both again at rank 3. And basically, you can already get a sense that this path is entirely around huge burst damage to front enemy units, and also works quite well again during Relentless, which definitely you see that as her major strengths. She has really high base damage, she has really high frostbite damage, one of the highest scaling damage possible during a Relentless fight, and also, and this is true of all of the Tethys Titansbane upgrade paths, is that there's only 1 capacity required, so it's quite easy to fit her into any other floor. In terms of weakness, she has no innate backline access, so all of her damage is going to hit front enemy units. She needs some support in hitting backline enemies, and she has incredibly low base health, second lowest base health in the game. Makes her very, very, very fragile to enemies. In terms of opportunities, she has an incredibly high benefit for multi-strike. On the one hand, that makes her scaling during bosses just absolutely go through the roof. And in addition, it also means that if she can kill the front enemy unit, then she has a little bit of backline access with a second or third strike. She also has pretty good benefit from trample. As long as you're able to get the front enemy unit down below her damage threshold, you're going to, at worst, you know, apply Frostbite onto the second enemy, which is already a lot of damage. And at best, you can then just clear out the entire floor. And she has a pretty good benefit from Quick as well. It kind of depends. If you really want her to hit bosses, that can be kind of bad because she'll end up killing the front enemy unit and not being able to apply her Frostbite onto flying bosses. But outside of that, Quick can be pretty good. In terms of protection, damage, shield, and armor is going to be best for you because her low health total, basically, lifesteal's not going to do much for her. Same with regen. So it's really all about protecting her via damage, shield, armor, and of course you can buff her health. Comes to threats, again, extremely weak to sweep. There is not a sweep unit that won't kill her. So the lowest damage sweep unit is a 4 damage sweep unit that will kill her outright. She's also extremely weak to spikes. There is the one boss that has 2 spikes. She can hit him twice. Apart from that, every single spikes will kill her in 1 hit. She's also kind of weak to Seraph the Chaste, specifically because Seraph the Chaste will cleanse his own Frostbite over time and Frostbite on the enemy units, which can be very, very annoying. Yeah, I mean, in general, during Relentless, she'll still be fine. But if you're trying to get flying kills or trying to kill other enemies, that can be problematic, as she'll the cleanse will get, the Seraph will cleanse those units and remove half of their Frostbite. Jumping into tactical tips and her role. So Chillwind Tethys is a glass cannon. She can easily kill most frontline units, and she does extremely high damage to bosses due to her Frostbite stacking. Definitely means you need a player in the back. Often you need to have at least 2 units in front of her. And you really need to find also a way to giving her health buffs, armor buffs, or even sap to keep her safe. And then with Seraph the Chaste, you just need to make sure you have sustain so that during Relentless you can stack enough Frostbite to kill him. In terms of deck building, priority units are Titan Sentry. Titan Sentry also helps with the back line. It also will start the Frostbite stacking on the front line. Guardian Stone is honestly a godsend for this type of build because Guardian Stone will naturally grant sustain onto Tethys as long as you're playing a lot of spells. Guard of the Unnamed becomes quite good as a really good scaling blocker for her. Lodestone Totem is also very, very good, protecting her from sweep, and also just in general allowing her to stack more Frostbite onto Relentless bosses as the bosses get sapped. Siren of the Sea is also quite good. I wouldn't recommend necessarily his Nameless Siren unless you have it as a second unit, just because the low health total is not going to protect Tethys that much. And then Glacial Seal also can become very useful for an AoE, in addition to helping to stack Frostbite onto especially flying bosses, but bosses in general. In terms of spells, Frenzied Swarm, anything you can do to not take damage is going to be key here. Frenzied Swarm doesn't work that well with Titan Sentry, but in general, if you are playing any other unit, Frenzied Swarm is going to be really, really beneficial. Hoarfrost Effigy to be able to kill those flying bosses, and it also works on enemy units as well. So you stack that Frostbite onto a front enemy unit, and then, you know, if maybe the second unit is the one that's in danger, or the one that's going to be dangerous to your pyre, you can use Hoarfrost Effigy and make sure you're killing the second unit. So there are ways to use Hoarfrost Effigy outside of bosses, but typically it's a boss killer. Titan's Tooth, again, stacking that Frostbite, clearing the backline. Guardian's Amulet, getting that sap on. Offering Monument, just further enabling all of these incants. And then Drain for targeted sap. That's usually used for sweep units. In terms of priority artifacts, Cuddlebeard is going to be your best friend. Cuddlebeard not only makes the Frostbite stronger, but it makes sure it doesn't decay, which can be extremely useful. As this typically Chillwind builds use incants to protect Tethys, Founding Seal becomes really important to double that incant power. Light's Gift allows you to play up on the top floor without really ever needing to worry about Tethys getting killed by sweep. Then the only thing you're worried about is spikes and having enough sustain for bosses. And that tends to really make the fight a lot easier. If you do get Light's Gift, what you want to do is put Titan Sentry on a lower floor and then get a second tank for Tethys. That way all the backliners are dying to the Titan Sentry, and then Tethys can kill the frontliners. Hammer Chestplates is also pretty good. It allows you to have a little bit more tankiness, doubling her base health, which is hilarious. But yeah, doubling her base health, so then she can actually tank one sweep hit from some units. Still not going to save her, but could be helpful in a pinch. Looking at secondary clans, starting with Hellhorned. Again, you want tanks, so Steelworker is going to be quite good. Demon Fiend is going to be quite good. Welder Helper can also get some early armor onto Tethys to keep her safe. But yeah, it's all about just getting a tank unit up front. And there's not really that many great tanks, but Steelworker tends to be pretty good because it has innate sustain. So as long as you can, you know, keep him from taking a lot of damage, he'll actually get quite tanky by the end. And Demon Fiend just has high base health. Difficult to play, you have to get an extra Ember somehow, but can be worth it just to protect Tethys. In terms of spells, Alloy of the Ancients is fantastic. It basically removes all of the major concerns around sap or spikes. She's not typically going to die if you use one Alloy of the Ancients on her. Fortify is also pretty good because it's targeted and doesn't bring her to the front line. One Horn's Tome is extremely valuable because she's already quite fragile, so getting an extra fragility stack doesn't really affect her that much. And then Vent for backline clearing. In terms of artifacts, Railhammer is the big one. Railhammer just makes any incant armor build absolutely insane. It makes the incant upgrade on units absolutely insane. So yeah, I mean, if you get a Guardian Stone and you get Railhammer, like it becomes super trivial to keep Tethys alive, and certainly can make the run just very, very easy to get through. Scorched Steel also helps, getting her some extra tankiness to start. Looking at Awoken, again, it's all about the tanks, so we're looking at Thorned Hollow, Woken Hollow, Husk Hermit. Thorned Hollow and Husk Hermit have a little bit more value in that they also provide backline access, so Thorned Hollow with the spikes and Husk Hermit with the sweep. Awoken Hollow is also pretty good just to get a really high health unit up front. The nice thing about Thorned Hollow and Awoken Hollow is it's very easy to fit then. If you increase capacity 1, you can fit a Guardian Stone or totally forgot the name right now. The Lodestone Totem. You can fit a Lodestone Totem in the middle, and then you can take advantage of all of the regen you're putting onto the Thorned Hollow and Oaken Hollow with incants that also make them all tankier, as well as potentially sapping enemy units. So pretty good synergy there. In terms of priority spells, Cycle of Life is actually really good, both because you can put it on your tank, whoever your tank is, to clear the backline. It's also very good on Tethys to give her some extra tankiness. You just play one on Tethys, and that gets rid of most of the concerns you have with sweep. You might need to play it a couple times if you have spikes, but really it's there also for that front enemy, or for the front tank, to clear the back line so that Tethys can then focus on the front line and the boss. Steel Enhancer, giving her some more tankiness as well. Glimmer, just for that sweep, and then for that backline access, and then Wildwood Tome, in case it does make sense. You need to be careful about how you use it, but getting quick on her can also be really good to clear units out before they have a chance to attack. Priority artifacts, Emblem of Exiles is always going to be a priority just to make your front unit tankier, and the Thorn Fruit tends to be quite good as well, giving you extra draw every turn and giving you some damage that you can use to try to get either front enemy units dead before they reach the Tethys floor, or just in general to add more damage to bosses and front enemy units. For Umbra, very similar story. Shadow Eater is very, very good in this build, especially because Tethys only takes up one capacity. It's very easy to get fit Tethys, Shadow Eater, even a Morsel Master, Morsel Maker, and then Morsels. So you have solid AoE, you have a solid tank, and then you have Tethys doing the frontline burst damage. If you don't have Shadow Eater, Crucible Collector, Crucible Warden also work just fine. You want to avoid things that are like heavy carries, like the Robot and Overgorger. I mean, they're good, but they're not going to tank very well. So you really want to focus on something that's more tanky in this build. In terms of priority spells, Furnace Tap, I mean, double stack, or not double stack, Multi-Strike. Multi-Strike is going to be your friend here. Umbra Stone as well. If you get Furnace Tap on Umbra and Umbra Stone, you're really in a happy place, because then you are able to clear most floors just with Tethys alone. Grovel tends to be really good for reasons we talked about during the Hornbreaker Prince. You play the Grovel onto Tethys, giving some damage shield, and then the morsels then go onto your tank to help them become tankier and have more sustain. Prismal Dust also works in a pinch to get some extra protection onto Tethys. In terms of priority artifacts, the same reason as Grovel, Prismal Dust, Chain of Gems also is very valuable. You can play Tethys, get that 2 damage shield out, and that's going to help her with the first 2 spike damage or the first 2 sweep attacks that hit her. Or if there's no sweep or spikes, that means 2 extra hits on bosses, which is going to do wonders for you in terms of frostbite stacking. And then, of course, Mind Jacks, right? So getting more capacity means that you can do more gorging on your tank. It also means you can fit more incant units. So only benefits from Mind Jacks. And finally, Melting Remnant. So with Melting Remnant, you can do Reform onto Tethys because she already has really high base stats, and she's not like really stacking anything. But I tend to like to do Endless with her, so kind of skipping around. Votive Key becomes quite good, Remnant Pact becomes quite good. Outside of that, it's more about protecting her, so then you want things like Molten Encasement, which will give her stealth, Legion of Wax, which is just a really heavy body to put in front of her to block all of the enemies during Relentless or even during standard combat. Lady of the House is pretty tanky, Lady of the Reformed is pretty tanky. And the nice thing is with both of them, you can fit a second unit in there. So if you want to fit another scaling unit, like if you want to increase capacity and get a big sludge in there, or a Wickless Baron, that also can work quite well. But the priority first is just getting a solid body in front of her to protect her. Engulfed in Smoke tends to be really good, again, for the same reason Molten Encasement is, just giving her stealth. Mortal Entrapment can also be really good, especially on Relentless fights. Usually, if you are playing flying bosses, you've at least put Frostbite on them at some point. So then it should be pretty easy to get Mortal Entrapment. Mortal Entrapment's also useful after. So if you put Tethys on a lower floor and you stack all that Frostbite, you can Mortal Entrapment to get more value out of your Pyre plus Frostbite damage. So that can also be really helpful. And then, yeah, as I said, Remnant Pact. In terms of other artifacts, Exploding Candle can become extremely useful for clearing the backline. It's one of the things that Melting Remnant doesn't have so much of is backline killing. So either you need to get that from the Stygian Guard spells or something like Exploding Candle. You can also, in a pinch, take something like a Fatal Melting, but the high cost kind of makes that a little bit prohibitive. And yeah, in general, the whole idea here with all of these secondary clans is protect Tethys and let Tethys do her Frostbite stacking. Next up, Conduit. Sorry about the... normally they should align with the arrows, but it's fine. So Conduit starts at rank 1 with a little bit extra damage, a little bit extra health, and all damage spells cost -1. At rank 2, the damage doubles, as does the spell cost reduction on damage spells, and she gets a little bit tankier. And then at rank 3, her damage doubles again. Her damage spells cost -3 on the floor, and she gets a little bit more tankiness as well. So she's definitely more of a support unit. Her main strengths are she has pretty high base damage, so 40 base damage is not bad. And then it's mostly about the high utility, right? So that basically by the end at rank 3, there are very few damage spells that aren't going to be free, which means that it's really about taking advantage of being able to play so many spells, and especially playing so many high damage spells. And again, similar to the other Tethys upgrade paths, 1 capacity means it's a lot easier to fit her onto floors. In terms of weaknesses, she has no innate backline access. She also has no scalable damage. So during Relentless fights, she's just going to be doing her flat 40 damage. It's not going to get much stronger over time. And she still has very low base health. Even at the max rank, she still only has 7 health. That's only enough to soak up a couple of spike hits or a couple of sweep hits. Opportunities. There's a moderate benefit from Multi-Strike. It's not particularly amazing, certainly not as good as Chillwind. I mean, the biggest benefit you're going to get is from magic damage spells. So the more magic damage spells you have in your deck, the more you're taking advantage of her text. She has extremely high synergy with incant units because she's able to play out all of the damage spells for free. In terms of protection, very similar with all Tethys builds. Damage shield plus armor is going to be better for you than lifesteal and regen in terms of protecting her from getting killed. And again, extremely weak to sweep, extremely weak to spikes, and Seraph the Diligent Consume can become problematic. When you have a build that relies on spells, anytime those spells are getting consumed can be an issue. Now there are ways around that, of course, but just be cautious with Seraph the Diligent that you don't accidentally get rid of all of your major damage spells early and they don't have them for the Relentless combat. Seraph the Patient also can be problematic because you're playing a lot of spells. That means a lot of rally triggers and incant triggers onto, I should say it's probably the incant trigger, not the rally trigger, onto Seraph the Patient, scaling up his damage quite a lot. So you have to be kind of careful and cautious about how you manage your incanting, knowing that you're also going to be incanting Seraph as well. In terms of tactical tips and the role, so Tethys here is a support unit with moderate damage, low health, and is really used, again, to cheat out high damage spells and help trigger incants on other units. Typically works best as a backliner so that you can fit as, and you want to fit as many incanters as you can. My experience, you usually want to put them on higher floors so that you have plenty of time for the incant units to scale. You don't have to play it that way, but certainly can make things a little bit easier, less risky when you have plenty of time to get that armor scaling, that health scaling, that damage scaling before the enemies reach the top floor. And the higher the cost of the spells, typically the more value you're getting. It's not always that higher cost spells are better, but with higher cost spells, typically you get more AoE, you get more ticks of damage, and so on. But regardless of the spell costs, it's really all about getting as much incant value as possible. So even non-damage spells can be really helpful if they're giving you more draw, or if they are supporting keeping your incanting going. So in terms of units, number one is Offering Monument. Getting Offering Monument with this build helps out a lot because you're going to be playing a lot of spells, and a lot of them are going to be free. So then Offering Monument allows you to get a huge burst of incant right at the start of the game, or right at the start of the round, and then once it dies, by then hopefully you've already gotten enough incants going that your units are prepared for combat and relentless combat. And then in terms of the actual main incanters, Siren of the Sea tends to work best as it's both tanky and high damage. Nameless Siren definitely has higher damage potential, but you lose that tankiness that you would get out of the Siren of the Sea. Guardian Stone, again, just adds tankiness to everyone on the floor, which is really valuable. Guard of the Unnamed can work. The biggest issue with Guard of the Unnamed is it just has very low damage, but from a tank perspective, it can be quite good. And during Relentless combat, Tethys will do quite a bit of damage, so it's not awful. And then Lodestone Totem, being able to reduce the damage on all the units. It's actually really good on top floor as well, because then on the highest floor, they're right about to go to the pyre. So if you can get enough sap, you don't really even care whether you kill the units on that floor. You just care that they're going to reach the pyre and take a lot of damage to the pyre. In terms of spells, Ancient Synergy is your friend here. It's a 3-cost spell that does insane amounts of damage, and especially if you're stacking a lot of spells, Ancient Synergy becomes really powerful. It's typically able to kill 1 or 2 frontline units, depending on how many spells you have and whether you have spell weakness or a lot of spells in your deck. Then I would put Ice Tornado pretty close behind it as a solid AoE that can take out backliners. Crypt Builder is also very good. It's especially good in a build like this where you don't have to worry about the cost as much, so you can just focus on adding more spell damage, getting that attuned text, giving it its value. Titan's Tooth for AoE clearing and for getting Frostbite stacks, and then Ice and Pyre as another, similar to Crypt Builder, just massive burst damage. And if you are playing the top floor, Ice and Pyre with Holdover can become invaluable at clearing front enemy units and allowing then Tethys and the other incanters to kill the backline. And finally, Harness the Titan. This is one of those that it doesn't get cost reduced, but it's quite easy to get -1 and holdover, and then you're able to scale up all of your damage spells, adding a lot of damage, especially to those attuned spells, and even the AoE ones like Ice Tornado and Ice Storm become very good. So this is, I mean, there's any damage spell is going to be good here, but these are the ones that I typically prioritize, trying to get the most value out of the cost reduction, as well as being able to clear units pretty reliably. In terms of artifacts, Founding Seal absolutely is going to be the best artifact, hands down. Outside of Founding Seal, Totem Fragment is also pretty good because you typically are playing in the top floor. So then having all of the units take triple spell damage tends to be really, really strong. A Forgotten Name as well, you're playing a lot of spells, so why not make those spells do more damage over time? Typically with Forgotten Name, if you think that you're going to trigger it every turn, that's going to be anywhere from 6 to 10 extra spell damage per spell, which is really valuable on Ice Tornado, Ancient Synergy, Crypt Builder. Any of these ones that either do multiple ticks or have attuned are really going to benefit from that extra damage. And then Volatile Gauge ends up being really good in this deck. It does make the units a little bit harder to play sometimes, but the value you're going to get out of the 3 extra draw is going to be huge in a deck where you don't really care about spell damage costs. So this is one of those few times where I would recommend Volatile Gauge, and it can work quite well in this build. In terms of secondary clans, with Hellhorned, #1 priority unit for me is Deranged Brute. If you get Deranged Brute, then you have a pretty solid tank, and you can actually start scaling Tethys to be quite strong. It also fits really well with Nameless Siren. So if you can fit a Nameless Siren and a Deranged Brute and Tethys, as long as you can add some health onto Deranged Brute, that Nameless Siren is going to get insanely strong. Play up on the top floor, blast enemy units, and profit. Transcendent also tends to be pretty good in builds like this. You can use them as chump blockers, so you have your other imps as chump blockers for the floor, and then you play Transcendent at the end to get a lot of value out of all of those summon triggers. And main reason you don't want a lot of Hellhorned units is they just don't really benefit from all of the spell damage. So then it's more about getting support units like the ones listed here. In terms of priority spells, oh, and I should also say one that's not on here but is a very close fourth would be Welder Helper. Getting extra tankiness onto the floor as well as potentially onto Tethys herself. The only issue is you need to make sure you have targeted damage in order to kill off the imps, especially Welder Helpers. And that can be difficult. There's not that many targeted spells. In fact, there's only one targeted spell, Flash Freeze in Stygian Guard. And then you'd have to be relying on targeted spells from Hellhorned instead. In terms of priority spells, Battering Ram tends to be really, really good in this deck. It's free, which is good to start with, and you typically have a lot of armor due to a lot of the incants granting armor stacks onto units. So then, yeah, if you can incant, and then play things like Battering Ram, you're going to blast front enemy units for lots and lots of damage. Branding Right is very, very good for your front tanks. You can also use it once onto Tethys without her dying. And it's also cost reduced because it is a damage spell, which is kind of cool. So you can get free armor stacking, quite a lot of armor, 20 armor for free, as long as the unit has enough base health. And then Vent for that AoE clear. Now that they've changed how the minus cost works, X cost cards now take benefit from the cost reduction of Conduit. So Vent actually plays for 0 and does 6 damage, which is pretty good. In terms of artifacts, again, Railhammer, man. Railhammer with incant builds is just absolutely insane. And secondarily, a Resonant Shard becomes really good. It enables more damage out of your Rage, and especially out of your Nameless Siren. For Awoken, really here, you want things that are going to support incanting. So for me, the top ones would be Vine Mother and Wildwood Custodian. Vine Mother is like primo in this build. It allows you to have a free incant trigger every turn that then draws more incant triggers, which is fantastic. Wildwood Custodian as well, it's just free draw. It's easy to fit onto a floor, and it's going to help you get more damage spells out, going to help you get more cards. You can also play Thorned Hollow. What I typically do with Thorned Hollow is put Thorned Hollow in the front, get an incant unit behind, and then put Tethys in the back, or maybe Tethys in the middle, depending on which incanter you get. But if you get something like a Nameless Siren or a Siren of the Sea behind Tethys and Thorned Hollow, tends to be a really strong build. You can use all of the heals onto Thorned Hollow, all the heals in regen, and then you blast enemy units with damage spells, get a lot of incants on your Siren in the back. So for spells, number 1 spell is Preserve Thorns. Preserve Thorns is 4 incants in 1 card. So it's going to really, it's going to enable a lot of incant power very quickly. Glimmer for that AoE. There's not really a lot of great damage spells. The only one that kind of works is Restoration Detonation. And then you're relying on units taking damage, and with the incant builds, you're typically relying on armor, and so they're not going to get a lot of actual health damage, so then it's kind of awkward. And then other things, just Root Seeds becomes really, really strong. And Adaptive Mutation. So Adaptive Mutation, we talked about this with the Hornbreaker Prince, but here it's more about the Nameless Siren. You can get insane amounts of health on the Nameless Siren by stacking all the rage with incants and then playing an Adaptive Mutation to swap the health and damage. It does mean that you're going to lose a little bit of damage when you do it, but the amount of health you gain from it is, you can't really ignore that amount of health. It will help a lot with relentless fights and in general keeping the Nameless Siren alive. Priority artifacts, Thorn Fruit. Again, anything to do to incant more is going to be good, and getting a free incant trigger every turn that also draws the next turn is certainly going to help. And Emblem of Exiles, getting that extra health onto the front unit, adding more tankiness. I mean, Emblem of Exiles is a priority in almost every single deck because it's so good. Moving into Umbra. So here, it's a little bit weird. You don't typically want to have lots of Gorgers on the floor with your Tethys. So here what I would recommend is you do a 2-floor setup. You have your Incant floor and you have your Gorge floor. And what's nice is that all of the Gorge spells can typically be played on the floor where you're incanting. So all your morsel generators, so your Shade Splitters, your Making a Morsel, your any of those morsel generators, you play them on the floor where you incant, and then you place the units on the floor where you have your Gorger. That tends to be pretty strong. And in that case, I think the biggest thing you want is AoE. That's kind of the hardest part, the hardest thing to come by with a lot of these builds. So then getting a Shadow Eater in there tends to be really good. You put a Shadow Eater on like the first or second floor, put your incant floor on the top floor, and create your morsels, do your AoE, and then in the meantime, prep your top floor for relentless combat. If you don't get Shadow Eater, Crucible Collector, Crucible Warden also works just fine. In terms of spells, Blazing Bolts is your friend. Blazing Bolts at 0 cost is absolutely insane, especially if you can add more damage to it. Excavation Eruption then as a base becomes 1 cost. It's a fantastic way to generate a lot of Ember very quickly. Forever Consumed is actually really, really good in this deck because of the interaction with Conduit and X costs. Now that's going to be doing 90 damage at 0, which is really insane. If you can get a lot of Ember, like if you have an Excavation Eruption and a Forever Consumed, you can get massive, massive amounts of front damage to front enemy units with Forever Consumed. And then Mind Collapse for the same reason. So Mind Collapse also takes benefit from the minus cost. So now it's 9 damage base at 0, allowing you to very easily kill off backline units and generate Ember. In terms of artifacts, Mind Jax is still my preferred. It does mean that you can't play on the top floor, so things like Ice and Pyre lose a little bit of value, but you get in return an extra full unit you can fit onto your incant floor, which is extremely valuable. And then after that, Shade Lamp. You're often killing units. You have a Gorge floor typically, so you have a Gorge floor and an Incant floor, and Shade Lamp's going to help that Gorge floor. And you can always, you can always play Morsels on your Incant floor. It's not awful, but typically this 2-floor setup works best in my opinion. And finally, Melting Remnant. So here it's all about protecting your floors and taking advantage of draws. There are a couple of interesting combinations here I want to highlight. So Molten Encasement, First is just purely to get stealth onto your incant floor. It does mean that you lose 1 capacity for a potential incant unit, but Molten Encasement, especially an endless Molten Encasement, becomes so valuable that it's almost always worth it. Entombed Explosive, not for the floor where you have your incant floor, but for a floor before to soften up units, can be really valuable as well. And then Votavary. So specifically with Votavary, if you get the Founding Seal, no, not Founding Seal. If you get if you get Waxer Snuffer with Votavary, you duplicate your Votavary, you get 2 Subsuming Blades, you can go infinite with Subsuming Blades. So the way that it works is you play 1 Votavary, you Subsuming Blade it, drawing another Votavary, you play that Votavary, you Subsuming Blade it to draw Subsuming Blade and Votavary, which you then use on, you play the Votavary, Subsuming Blade the Votavary, you draw Subsuming Blade and Votavary, and it continues endlessly. So you can get an infinite combo, giving you infinitely high damaging Subsuming Blades, allowing you to first turn every single boss and kill every unit in the game. It's again, it requires Waxer Snuffer, but as long as you can get Waxer Snuffer and Votavary, you don't even necessarily have to do Subsuming Blade, but it's the easiest one to stack infinitely. But even without Subsuming Blade, if you have any targeted damage, you can kill Votavary and go infinite very, very easily. The other combo I want to mention is Molded. If you get Founding Seal and Molded and the Offering Monument, it's another infinite. What you can do is you play 1 offering, so you have 2 Offering Monuments, you play 1 of them, you get it down to where it's going to die, and then you kill it off. You play your second Offering Monument. You play Molded to bring back your first Offering Monument. The spell draws 2 cards, drawing another Molded. Then you play your new Offering Monument. You play Molded to bring back the one that just died. You play the one that just got reformed. Play another Molded, drawing more cards. So it's like this, again, it's this infinite combo where your Offering Monuments are getting reformed, getting infinite scaling on their damage. It also allows for insane incants on that floor because you're playing Molded over and over and over and over again. So those are 2 infinite combos I wanted to highlight. I'm not super into infinite combos, but these ones are pretty reliable and only require 1 artifact to get set up, which is pretty good. And then it's only 2 cards. So it's a pretty simple one. If you get one of these artifacts early, either Founding Seal or Waxer Snuffer, and you have Melting Remnant, these are 2 very, very easy infinites to set up. Outside of those infinite combos, Fatal Melting tends to be pretty good. You can just add 10 damage to it, and then it's a free 10 damage AoE. Or if you are killing units off a lot, if you're doing like Votavary, not shenanigans, Melting Remnant can become, a Fatal Melting can become really powerful. Outside of that, Subsuming Blade, 0 cost Subsuming Blade, it's pretty easy to stack. Excuse me. And then Mortal Entrapment. A free Mortal Entrapment is always going to be helpful for Relentless Combat. And if you have multiple of them, you can get a lot of days onto the boss. And if you're playing Stygian Guard, you're going to have plenty of ways to damage the boss before they reach the top floor. Other artifacts, Encased Ember. So if you are playing either of these tomb units, Encased Ember is going to give you more Ember to play out more stuff, which is always going to be good for you. And then Votive Key. Having an Endless on a lot of these units can become very, very valuable. Especially things like, you can get like Siren of the Sea, and if Siren of the Sea dies, you can then bring her back on a later floor, and she'll have all of her stats. Alternatively, you can play it on tomb units and have infinite tomb units, so a lot of value there. So in general, the goal here is really about incanting, and it's everything that can enable incanting and taking advantage of all of the free damage spells to incant much harder. And then outside of that, you can do some other things like scaling damage spells to insanely high damage, but that tends to be more difficult, and I think there are better builds to do that in. But yeah, so for me, this is really like the primo incant build. It's why Conduit is so much stronger in a lot of ways than the other 2 Tethyses. It's certainly more consistent, because all you need is a good incanter, and you then have extremely easy incanting to do. So I think a lot of people don't like Conduit, but I think that's a little bit that they just aren't playing it correctly. If you play Conduit as an incant build and not as a spell damage build, you're going to have a much better time. Alright, Handheld Totem. So Handheld Totem is a 5 damage, 6 health champion that sweeps. She also has text. strike applies spell weakness 1 to the attacked unit. At rank 2, the spell weakness doubles from spell weakness 1 to spell weakness 2, and she gains 2 health. And it's at rank 3, she gains an additional health and gets another spell weakness. So Handheld Totem's a little bit interesting. Certainly, you're going to like the innate backline access, so the fact that you can clear backliners with your Tethys is going to be good. The scaling damage is really the key here, though, and it's about how do I set it up in a way that I can basically one-shot bosses. That's really the name of the game here. Again, the same benefit as the other the 3 Tethys upgrade paths is that they all have 1 capacity requirement, so it's quite easy to fit. But yeah, so it's taking advantage of that backline access and taking advantage of the spell damage potential that you can get with Handheld Totem is the key to victory here. Weakness side, very low base damage. So even though you can do backline access, you're certainly not going to be scaling up a lot of damage on the frontliners or onto the bosses. Innately, you have to have a way to do damage with spells. And you have very, very low base health, even though it is the highest base health out of all the Tethys builds, or Tethys upgrade paths, it's still very low. In terms of opportunities, it's very, very good with multi-strike. 1, it helps to clear the backline much easier, and 2, it helps to stack that spell weakness much, much more reliably. It's also a very good unit to do rage and damage buffs onto. That's true of all sweeps, just because then you're applying that same rage and damage buffs to all of the units, or enemy units. It's pretty good with trample. It's not the best trample sweep unit, but it's still pretty good. So the way that trample works with sweep is that if you kill a unit during the sweep attack and you have trample, any excess damage will get carried over, and if it's the backline unit, that damage gets carried over into the front line. What's great about it with something like Handheld Totem is that those extra damage ticks will carry over also the text, the strike effects. So if you, for example, if you have a floor with a high health frontline unit and then 2 low health backline units, you're going to get a double carryover, so you'll have 2 extra strikes. Those 2 extra strikes will apply the spell weakness again onto the front unit. So you can get massive stacks of spell weakness onto flying bosses and onto frontline enemy units with that trample. It's also really good with quick. With quick, Tethys can kill backliners before they have a chance to attack, saving you some health, armor, or damage shield on your units, and also potentially stopping the units from killing you. And then, yeah, same with the other Tethys builds. It's really about damage, shield, and armor, unless you find a way to stack health. Much better than lifesteal and regen here. Although regen is a little bit better because you do have some health to take advantage of, but certainly lifesteal is not going to be particularly great. In terms of threats, it's high health frontline units. She really has no way to kill frontline units without also having spell damage or support from other units. She's very weak to sweep. And the thing with sweep units is they typically have high health, so she's not going to likely be able to one-shot them before they kill her, or at least hit her, and extremely weak to spikes. So with sweep, she can usually take 2 or 3 sweep hits, depending on the sweep. If it's a 6 damage, it's 2. If it's a 4 damage, it's 3. But with spikes, the problem with sweep units and spikes is that they get spike damage from every unit they hit. So if you have 3 units with spikes, that's already going to be something like 6 or 12 or even 15 damage that will kill her outright. So be very, very cautious around spikes. The idea here is if you have to do with spikes, you try to kill the units before they have a chance to get to your floor with Tethys. Seraph the Chase cleanse effect is going to be really annoying because it's going to take out half of the spell weakness on Seraph and the units that he cleanses. And for Seraph the Temperament, you got to be careful that Tethys does any damage at all. So the sap really starts to stack up very quickly. You have very low health or very low damage to begin with. It's very easy to get into a situation where Tethys just isn't attacking anymore because she's been sapped out to 0 or even not negative damage, but 0 damage for a long time. So Handheld Totem, she is a low health support unit which has innate sweep. So she fills kind of two roles. One, she can clear the back line, and two, her utility in stacking spell weakness on frontliners and bosses. In order to take advantage of the spell weakness, you have to play on either the bottom or middle floor. If you stack the spell weakness on the top floor, then the units just go to the pyre, and you don't get a chance to play any real spell damage there. So you want to play on the bottom middle floor, and you want to put them. This fits on two reasons, right? So you have the spell weakness stacking, but you also you typically want to have your sweep units lower so they can clear the back line. And then have the potential to kill the front line much easier on a higher floor. And again, just be very careful during boss fights that you don't accidentally clear spell weakness with weak spells. This can happen all the time, right? So you stack all the spell weakness and you play something like a Titan's Tooth, and you end up doing 5 times 4 damage, 20 damage, rather than playing something much better like an Ancient Synergy or even a Helical Crystallis or something like that. So just be really cautious when you're doing AoE. Make sure that you're not wasting your spell weakness on a boss or on a unit, and instead make sure you're trying to play those high damage spells first. In terms of deck building, here Icy Silophyte tends to be really good. It's just extra stacking of spell weakness and extra backline access. The nice thing about Icy Silophyte, if you can get multi-strike and quick, is she'll, combined with Tethys, typically be able to clear out anything with 1 or 2 health, and then they together can stack insane amounts of spell weakness onto bosses and onto frontline enemy units. And then outside of Icy Silophyte, it's mostly things that are going to protect Tethys, so Guardian Stone, Guard of the Unnamed. Mollusk Mage actually is pretty good. You don't want to play Mollusk Mage on the same floor as Tethys. You want to put Mollusk Mage on a higher floor so that you stack all the spell weakness, and then on the next floor up, Mollusk Mage is increasing the base damage of all of your spells, which then gets multiplied by the spell weakness. Siren of the Sea tends to be pretty good as a kind of blocker, and then Siren of the Sea, I meant Titan Sentry, and then Siren of the Sea tends to be really good on the same floor where you're playing all of your damage spells. So you typically have a floor where you have Tethys plus some tanks, and then you have something like Siren of the Sea or Nameless Siren where you're going to be playing all your damage spells, combine them with a Mollusk Mage to do even more damage, and that's the kind of setup you want. So you have a 2-floor setup, one where you're doing your spell weakness, and then one where you're taking advantage of that with spells. Priority spells here are going to be all your big hitters. So Ancient Synergy, Ice and Pyre, Crypt Builder. Ice Storm tends to be pretty good as long as you can get some increased magic damage on it. Ice Tornado tends to be pretty good. And then similar, as we talked about before, Harness the Titan tends to be really good. One that's missing here that should be on here as well, in fact I would even put it maybe in the 2 or 3 slot, is the Gifts for a Guard. So apologize for not having that on the sheet. I'll update it before I make this available. But Gifts for a Guard is one of the top tier picks here. Gifts for a Guard allows you to insanely stack your spell damage. And the trick here is with Gifts for a Guard, what you want is to put Consume onto something. So you put like Consume onto your Ancient Synergy, and then you get Consume removal. And maybe Ancient Synergy is a bad example because then it becomes 4 cost. But let's say Ice and Pyre. You add 20 spell damage to it and Consume. That makes it a 190 base damage spell, which is already insane. Then you remove Consume, making it a 2-cost spell, and then you use Gifts for a Guard. I guess Gifts for a Guard, the other advantage too is it's reducing the cost, so even Ancient Synergy works. And then you play your spell. It doesn't get consumed because it has Consume removal. You can keep Gifts for a Guard over and over and over and over again, insanely stacking up the spell damage, and then get like an insane spell for your Relentless Combat or for your front enemy units. So apologize it's not on there, but I'll add it on there before we make the entire overview available. In terms of artifacts, a Forgotten Name is extremely helpful. Every one of those magic damage increases is going to get multiplied by the amount of spell weakness you can do. So and you're typically going to be playing a lot of spells, so getting 8 to 10 extra magic damage is going to be that times as many spell weaknesses you get onto your units, onto the enemy units damage. Totem Fragment just adds extra magic damage on top, or sorry, spell weakness on top of the already spell weakness you're going to generate. So having an extra 2 multiplier is certainly going to help with killing off a lot of the bosses, and as well, especially early game, that becomes really valuable for clearing off front enemy units. Founding Seal, again, if you're incanting, Founding Seal is going to double that incant. And then Split Anvil actually is really, really good. So Split Anvil allows you to play a high cost spell like Ancient Synergy, and then all the rest of your spell damage or your spells that you have in hand are going to become free. So it allows you to take advantage of playing a lot of spells all at once, especially things like Harness the Titan. And then if you can get Harness the Titan to be 0, you play Harness the Titan, you play your Ancient Synergy, and then all the rest of your spells become free. In terms of secondary clans, priorities here, again, doing a kind of rage-oriented setup can be good. And the problem here is that there's not a lot of units that are particularly great. So for me, it's all about how do I take advantage of text, and the best text is Deranged Brute. The other nice thing about Deranged Brute is then if you're able to get Fledgling Imps or any type of rage increases onto Tethys, that's going to help with her sweep and clearing backliners much easier and doing a lot more damage to frontliners. And then Welder Helper, making your front unit tankier, is always going to be helpful. And then if you have Fledgling Imp and Welder Helper, get Transcend Imp. So it's mostly Imp synergies that are going to be quite good, with Deranged Brute as the standout, because you can then rage stack. In terms of priority spells, Inferno becomes really, really good in this build, as long as your second floor doesn't have units on it. But being able to stack a lot of spell weakness and then Inferno the floor after is a more or less guaranteed way to kill bosses and kill other units as well. So yeah, and the nice thing about Inferno is that it's an AoE pierce, so it's going to hit everything and kill everything. One Horn's Tome, getting that multi-strike, and again, Tethys is already pretty fragile, so you're not super concerned about getting fragile text onto Tethys. You need to find other ways to protect her anyway, and a good way to protect her is Alloy of the Ancients. Any type of armor is going to be good, but Alloy of the Ancients has the benefit of just like being a one and done, and then you never really have to worry about her dying to sweep or spikes from that point on. In terms of priority artifacts, Railhammer, again, if you're doing armor, and there's a lot of armor value to get out of Stygian Guard with the incant triggers, then Railhammer is going to make that much more powerful, and Resonant Shard to increase rage damage. If you're getting rage onto this particular Tethys, it ends up being really strong for clearing backliners. Awoken, here it's again about tanks, so Awoken Hollow, Thorned Hollow, Wilting Sapwood. Wilting Sapwood especially becomes relevant here because a lot of the spells are, especially the damage spells, are pretty expensive. So then getting something like Wilting Sapwood with a lot of health allows you to generate a lot of Ember, which then you can use to use heavy damage spells, and especially for bosses, right? So you have your Tethys plus your Wilting Sapwood on the middle floor. The bosses generate a lot of Ember for the next turn, which then you can use to do a lot of damage spells. In terms of priority spells here, Razor Sharp Edge is really good. Similar to getting something like Rage, getting a Razor Sharp Edge, you can play it 4 times on a Tethys before it kills her. That's an extra 40 sweep damage, which is really valuable in clearing most middle and backline units. It also does quite a lot of damage to the front line in that case. Wildwood Tome, getting her to be quick, not only enables her to kill backliners before they have a chance to attack, it also allows her to stack 1 extra stack of spell weakness onto bosses, which might become relevant. Steel Enhancer, also very good, increasing her health, increasing her damage. And then Bramble Ash. Bramble Ash, if you have any type of Thorn generation, so if you have a Thorned Hollow, or if you get Sharpen or Cycle of Life, Bramble Ash becomes really, really good. You can get massive, massive burst damage out of a Bramble Ash. If you have like a 2-floor setup, you have let's say a Thorned Hollow, or you have a unit that's taking advantage of a lot of spikes on the top floor, then you stack all the spell weakness on the middle floor. When the bosses go up to the top floor, you can hit them with Bramble Ash for thousands of damage. And then priority artifacts here, honestly the only one that's particularly great is Emblem of Exiles. You can still get Thorn Fruit. The problem with Thorn Fruit is oftentimes you're going to end up losing the spell weakness, but it can also be really good. Probably it should still be here, but yeah, then it's about just making sure you're not playing your Sting, getting rid of the spell weakness before you play your spells that actually do damage. For Umbra, it's tanks. And here you don't really need sweep, so Shadow Eater tends to be less valuable because you already have the sweep with Tethys. And then it's all about units that can damage the front line pretty well, and then your muscle generation. And actually, Tethys tends to be a decent gorger because of the sweep. If you get like a morsel maker plus a Tethys, that actually tends to be pretty good. She'll be pretty tanky from all of the gorging, and she'll also have quite a bit of damage sweep to do to backliners and to even frontliners at that point. In terms of priority spells, Furnace Tap with the caveat that you need to make sure you can still play your spells afterward. This isn't a problem for Relentless because Relentless, your Tethys is going to die, so then you lose all the Ember Drain. But before that, if you're relying on spells to clear units and then you use Furnace Tap, it can be really difficult to play damage spells in that case. So just be cautious. Make sure that you have Ember Generation or that you have your damage spells are all 0 cost or able to be 0 cost, or else you're going to really struggle with Furnace Tap. Outside of that, Umbra Stone, getting that trample is really good, as I talked about before, for that carryover effect. And then Blazing Bolts, really, really high damage spell, takes advantage of all that spell weakness, and Excavation Eruption has the double effect of not only doing tons of damage, but also generating Ember for you. So that tends to be pretty good. In terms of artifacts, it's very similar to the others. Chain of Gems, get that damage shield onto Tethys, and then Mind Jacks, getting more space to play more units. Melting Remnant. Melting Remnant's a little bit of a weird one with this build, but there are a couple things that you can do that can be really valuable. So first, I would recommend doing a Harvest build. So you have a Harvest unit in front of Tethys. Tethys will clear the backline, getting more Harvest stacks. Those Harvest stacks translate into typically more damage. So Wickless Tycoon, Big Sludge, their damage is going to scale up. Big Sludge is a little bit dangerous because you don't have high health total on Big Sludge as a base, but then if you get something like Molten Encasement or an Entombed Explosive to go in front, you get the double benefit of it harvesting, as well as the effect can be really good, and the block for Big Sludge can be really good. And you can fit all of them without having to increase capacity. Otherwise, Legion of Wax is also really good. Anything that's going to allow you more time to get more spell weakness stacks on the bosses is going to be key, and protect Tethys. In terms of spells, Wicklash, as long as you have enough burnout generators, Wicklash can be insane on Tethys. You can get a lot of damage, and that damage is going to sweep, and she can actually become a damage carry with enough support with Wicklash. If you get Wicklash and you have enough burnout, then get Paraffin Enforcer. The two of them are going to scale to the moon. So yeah, absolutely, you can do a burnout-oriented thing, burnout-oriented setup with Tethys. You just need to make sure she's not dying to burnout. Memento Mori can also be really insane as long as you have enough units dying. So if you get things like Votivary or Tomb units that have Endless, or Tomb units that can be reformed, and you're getting enough kills, then Memento Mori can become really, really powerful as a finisher for the bosses after they get a lot of spell weakness. Engulfed in Smoke tends to be pretty good just to get more spell weakness and get more damage, and also protect your units. Mortal Entrapment for the same reason. In terms of and Mortal Entrapment also, it can be a damage spell because it has attuned now, so you can do like plus 20 magic damage to it, and that will add a lot. It'll add an extra 100 damage, so 125 damage spell. So it can also be relevant from a damage perspective, but I would say still normally you're using it to take advantage of the days. In terms of artifacts, Flicker's Liquor tends to be really good in builds like this, especially because you have a lot of high-cost spells, and then you play Flicker, you play a unit, reduce that 3-cost spell to a 0, and then you can play it for free. Waxer Snuffer is typically very, very good in builds like this. You can put it onto Tethys to keep her safe. Or not Waxer Snuffer, I was thinking of Votive Key. Waxer Snuffer is primarily for Molten Encasement and Entombed Explosive, that you can get double effect of the stealth or double effect of the burst, which tends to be really good at killing frontliners and also protecting your floor. And then Encased Ember. Again, if you have 2 units, Encased Ember becomes really, really good at helping enable you to play all of your high-cost damage spells. So in general here, the name of the game is stack that spell weakness as best you can, get tanks, get whatever you can to protect Tethys, and then make sure you have really, really strong finishers. What I would recommend is if you're worried about drawing into your damage spells, Holdover and Permafrost are your friends. And just make sure that you're not in a situation where you've stacked all this spell weakness and have no spell to use it with. Could be one of the worst feelings with a build like this. Okay, so then looking at Tethys, Titansbane from a flexing perspective, and then going into my prioritized ranking. Let's start with the flex upgrade paths. So Handheld Totem actually works pretty well as a single flex option for both Conduit and Chillwind. So for Chillwind, it adds that sweep effect, gives it a little bit more tankiness, and then you can apply that frost to all the units on the floor. That can be helpful for also certain Seraph fights as well, because then you can apply it more reliably onto Seraph during the flying phases, and then try to stack it either using Hoarfrost Effigy or other types of stacking. And yeah, occasionally that spell weakness might come in handy as well, but primarily it's used to get Frostbite onto more units. For Conduit, it's that Conduit at level 3, you don't always need that third cost reduction on the damage spells. Even getting just -2 cost can be pretty valuable. So then you take the sweep just as a way to turn Tethys into a backline killer, and as well you get some spell weakness, which might be relevant for some of the boss fights. Conduit, you typically don't want to flex into either upgrade path. The third spell weakness on Handheld Totem plus the extra tankiness tends to be much more valuable, and then with Chillwind, it's really more about just getting that extra raw damage. And then finally with Chillwind, you can add Chillwind as well as a one-off for Handheld Totem, which can be useful to clear off backliners. That usually gives you enough damage. I think it's, 10 damage base, and is it 5 Frostbite? I can't remember exactly the numbers there, but ends up being pretty valuable for clearing backliners, and certainly more valuable in the getting Conduit onto the Handheld Totem upgrade path. In terms of my prioritization, my personal ranking, I think Conduit and Chillwind are about equal. Conduit makes an incant deck much easier to put together. Chillwind is also incredibly powerful during relentless fights. You really just need a big tank and then some way to clear backliners, and you're set. Handheld tends to be much trickier, only because it's not guaranteed you're going to get the damage spells you need. And if you don't get strong damage spells, having the spell weakness doesn't do anything. So you can get kind of unlucky with drafts and then just be out of luck. But still, Handheld is also very good. All 3 upgrade paths are pretty solid. Yeah, for me, I think Conduit, Chillwind, a little bit easier to pull off. You have a lot more flexibility with the units and spells you can get. So that would be my pick. And then moving on. All right, next up is Umbra Clan with Penumbra. So, lore. I have no hard facts on its origin, but is rumored to be the beginning of the Shroud itself, formed in the long-forgotten depths of the Crucible and giving life to the rest of Hell. This would make it the first being of Hell. It has yet to confirm or deny my questioning on the matter. So Penumbra has this kind of like ancient feel to it, right? So it's supposed to be very old, supposed to be this origin, ancient, almost like think of it as like Lovecraftian kind of creature, based around shadows. So I don't know if you know. So Penumbra and Tumbra and Umbra are all different parts of a shadow. So this is again this kind of shadow, ancient shadow creature. From a design perspective, you get this idea that it's this incredibly huge, powerful shadow being. So with that design in mind, let's look at gameplay and see how well that design gets executed in the different build upgrade paths or upgrade paths. So first we have Architect.
Architect is summon, gain extra capacity on the floor. It's a pretty high damaging unit with moderate health. This one's a little bit weird for me. From a design perspective, I don't know what about Penumbra screams building more space or getting more space. So this is a little bit of dissonant with the design, but maybe there's something there about Penumbra as the original shadow building shadows or something like that. But this out of the three seems to be the least directly related to the design. Monstrous, I think Monstrous definitely gives off that huge, massive creature that is just going to overwhelm the enemies. Definitely fits the design, I think, quite well. It has trample, so nothing can escape its wrath, and then this huge amount of damage and quite healthy health total. And then Glutton, I think Glutton also kind of fits that as well, right? So Glutton's all about gorging the shadows and getting huge after eating and consuming and getting mass. I think that also kind of fits this design of this ancient creature that just feeds on the shadows, gets really big, and then can scare you to death. So 2 out of 3 paths, I think, have a direct correlation with the design. Architect, maybe not so much, but enough about the design. Let's talk about the gameplay and deck building and go into more detail around the different upgrade paths. We'll start with Architect. So Architect's paths, you start off as a 25 damage, 20 health unit with text summon +2 capacity on this floor. At rank 2, that damage doubles and you get an additional 10 health, and in addition you get +3 capacity on the floor instead of +2. And then at rank 3, the damage doubles again, you get another extra 10 health, and you get to add a 4th capacity. So let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses then. So strengths, you have pretty high net base damage. Maybe not at level 1 or rank 1, but at rank 2 and 3, 50 damage and 100 damage is certainly strong enough for most runs, assuming you can take advantage of that damage. And it's a kind of net gain capacity. So at rank 1, it's a quote 1 capacity unit because you have to play 3, but then you get 2 back. At rank 2, it's a neutral capacity, so you get to play it for free in terms of capacity. And then at rank 3, you actually gain 1 capacity, meaning that you can fit even more units on the floor where you play Penumbra, which is quite strong. No other unit can do that. In terms of weaknesses, it doesn't have any innate backline access. As well, there's no innate damage scaling, and there's no innate sustain. So as a standalone unit, it's definitely not going to be powerful enough to defeat most bosses. But as a support unit, that's really where you're getting the value out of it, is getting value out of that capacity that it grants. So opportunities, that's a pretty high benefit for multi-strike. You think 50 damage, 100 damage. A multi-strike is certainly going to be good with that. That'll take out most frontliners, if not all frontliners, as well as if you can kill the frontliner, then that will kill multiple backliners. Quite good. A moderate benefit from trample. You still have to buff the damage quite a bit to get the trample to be worthwhile, but if you can buff the damage and get trample, then it can be worth it. And again, a moderate benefit from quick. If you can take out some units before they have a chance to attack, that's always going to be beneficial. Not necessarily the best unit to have quick, but it can be okay. And this is going to be true of all of the Penumbra paths. They have high damage, high health, or high damage, moderate health. And with high damage and moderate health, especially if your damage is higher than your health, lifesteal becomes king here, because each tick of lifesteal means a full heal back to full health, where regen you'd have to stack it quite a bit. Damage, shield, and armor are typically not as good, because the idea with a lot of these Penumbra builds is that you want to have Penumbra as either a tank or at least as a blocker in the middle. And in that case, getting lifesteal is going to help take the most advantage of their high health. Comes to threats, there's not really any direct threats with Architect. The only one I could really think of is Seraph the Patient's rally trigger, but that's so easy to work around that I feel like it's not really worth even mentioning. the reason why it doesn't have any direct threats is that there's nothing that the Seraphs or that other units can exploit. It's just adding capacity, and it's a strong unit. So it's not really weak to sweep. It's not really weak to spikes. It's not really weak to cleanse. It's not really weak to, I guess melee weakness. But as we'll talk about, it's typically, especially with Architect, you're not planning to tank with your Architect Penumbra. So. And one of the rare champions doesn't have any direct weaknesses, but I would say it's compensated by the fact that it doesn't have any real scaling, sustain, or backline access. In terms of its role, so Architect Penumbra is a high damage, moderate health support unit. At rank 2 and 3, it can be considered, you can think of it as kind of like free damage that you're adding into an existing floor. So if you have a floor like an Incant floor, or a Gorge floor, or a Rage floor, you're just getting 100 free damage onto that floor. And as long as you weren't already reaching the unit cap of 7 per floor, that's just 100 free damage you added, which can be really powerful in a lot of decks. Due to the summon triggers, you always want to place Penumbra first. You don't want to accidentally block yourself out of capacity. That's often a common mistake, right? You play something else, then you try to play Penumbra and realize that you don't have any capacity to play him. So make sure you play him first. And what I would recommend is he's typically best in the middle or back line. You don't really want him tanking because he only has at max rank 40 base health and at first rank 20 base health. It's not really enough to tank a lot of damage. So if you can put a bunch of blockers in front of him, especially like a Gorge floor. So like this is my preferred way of doing Architect. You place Architect, you place a Gorger in front of Architect, and that Gorger is going to be your tank, and the Architect just becomes free damage on top of your tank's damage or your Gorger's damage. If you don't do a Gorger, then you could think of like a Titan Sentry for Stygian Guard, or a Hollow in Awoken, but you have a tank up front, and then you put Penumbra in the middle or the back. A good setup, again, as I mentioned, is to have a solid tank Gorger in front, leaving room for morsels and chump blockers. And one last note is that Transcend Imp will copy Penumbra's summon trigger. So Transcend Imp becomes an insanely powerful unit. Even if you don't have any other imps, just being able to resummon and resummon and resummon Transcend Imp to get more space means that it's very easy to hit that 7-unit cap, and even get massive units like Shadow Siege and I don't know, the Hollows, and even, I don't know, what Legion of Wax, whatever, right? So you can just get a bunch of large units in the space quite easily. We're talking about deck building for Umbra. It's all about the Gorgers. So for me, Crucible Collectors, typically the primo. The one exception is against Seraph the Patient. You would prefer to have Crucible Warden because damage shield's better against the Patient than the Lifesteal. But in all other cases, I would do Crucible Collector. If you don't have a Crucible Collector or Crucible Warden, Shadow Eater also works in a pinch. Shadow Eater also has the benefit of accessing the backline quite easily. So that can work quite well. The only issue with Shadow Eater is it typically doesn't survive as long because it has no sustain scaling like the Crucible Collector or Crucible Warden. And then, of course, if you're going to be gorging, get Morsel Master, Morsel Maker. And one last note on Shadow Siege. At rank 3, without even taking a capacity relic, you can fit Shadow Siege on the same floor as Architect. The only thing with Shadow Siege, and I'll put this on, I have it as a priority unit on every single one of the Umbra builds. All of them with an asterisk. If you can play Shadow Siege, take him. If you can't play him, don't take him. That's basically it. If you have Ember Relics, if you have the capacity, if you have Ember generating spells, if you have Ember reduction type stuff, then take Shadow Siege. Otherwise, go with something else. In terms of spells, Furnace Tap's always going to be a priority. Getting Furnace Tap on him means an extra 100 damage at rank 3, an extra 50 damage at rank 2. It's incredibly powerful, very easy to try to fit into a deck. Umbra Stone as well, if you can buff his damage a little bit, or even if you can't, that 100 damage carryover effect could kill a lot of backliners. As long as you have something like a Crucible Warden, Crucible Collector, they're going to do some upfront damage to the front enemy unit. And then with Umbra Stone on Architect Penumbra, you can probably get over that threshold and kill the backliners as well. Cannibalized becomes quite good because you have lots of space, similar with Grovel and Gem Trove. Having lots of space means you can fit lots of morsels naturally. With Gem Trove, only caveat is just making sure you have enough Ember to play it. Gem Trove also is quite good if you have a huge floor where you have a bunch of units that are like actual like carry units, and then a separate floor with Gorge. You can have, like, for example, let's say you're playing Hellhorned. You have a bunch of demons, and then you have your Architect. You can Gem Trove that to get all of them damage shield, and then place all the morsels on your separate Gorge floor. And that's a pretty good setup. And then Wretch in general. Anytime you have lots of capacity, Wretch is going to be much better. The biggest problem with Wretch is that sometimes you get overloaded with too many morsels. With something like Architect, that rarely happens. Priority artifacts, Fossilized Fangs. If you're going to be doing gorging, which you probably are going to do with Architect, Fossilized Fangs becomes a priority to double those gorge triggers. Chain of Gems could be quite good as a way to get some easy damage shield onto Architect. That can represent 2 extra full hits on a boss, which can be really powerful. It's extra, 100 or 200 damage. Abandon Untumbra, being able to get free morsels, same with Shade Lamp. Getting free morsels that then you can play on your floor with Architect or on your Gorge floor. In terms of secondary clans, for Hellhorn, number 1, Transcend Imp, for the reasons already stated. It doubles the summon trigger. After that, Fledgling Imp. If you have a lot of units in a floor, playing something like Fledgling Imp will grant all of them extra rage. Including Architect, that becomes really, really powerful, especially if you have something like Endless, or if you just have a lot of the Fledgling Imps, that can be really, really strong. Branded Warrior as well is quite good. For the same reason, you can put Branded Warrior and Architect behind your Gorger or behind your tank, and they will then, the Branded Warrior has a good chance of killing a backliner, giving the entire floor rage. It's like having an overstacked floor without actually having to overstack. In terms of priority spells, Branding Right typically is very, very good. It's good on your Architect. You're going to gorge with your tank, and then you can stack armor onto Architect. That tends to be a pretty good combination. Imp in a Box is really, really strong. Most of the imps are all going to be pretty valuable in Umbra in general. The Rage is always good. The armor's typically pretty good. The Ember certainly is going to be good. So yeah, getting Imp in a Box is very valuable. Alloy of the Ancients, again, just to get some extra armor onto Architect to protect him for relentless combat. And then Vent. One of the problems with Architect decks can often be getting backline kills, unless you have something like Shadow Eater. So then if you don't have something like Shadow Eater or any other types of backline access, Vent can be really helpful just to clear out those backline units. In terms of artifacts, Ashes of the Fallen is amazing. Ashes of the Fallen works with Penumbra, so that's an automatic double trigger on the summon if you take it. So that's then adding 4, 6, and 8 capacity to a floor. That's insane. And then Impsicle. Imps are just really, really good in decks where you have a lot of space. And the thing with imps as well is you can chump block with them. So let's imagine you have like a Crucible Warden or a Crucible Collector in front, then you have your Architect, and then you have your morsels are going to go behind. You can also put imps in the front. The imps will block the hits, protecting your tank, and then typically they're doing some type of benefit. Either they're clearing backline units, or they're giving rage or giving armor or something like that. Moving into Awoken, for me it's about the sweep. You want a lot of sweep, again, to get backline access. So Shattered Shell's, I think, the best of the sweep units because it scales. Then Husk Hermit. And then the reason why I pick both of those priority over Thorned Hollow is because you can fit them on a Gorge floor. So you can get, so imagine rank 3 Penumbra without taking any other capacity. So you'll get, starting with 5, you place Penumbra, he gets an extra 1, so now you have a 6 capacity floor. You can fit a Crucible Warden and a Shattered Shell and still have 2 more morsels left. So that's why I prioritize them. You can still get a Gorger up front, which is going to be a better tank, and then you have these sweep units behind to clear out the back line. If you don't have one of the sweep units, you can always do like a Animus of Will, also works. And then Thorned Hollow, if you don't have a Gorge floor, Thorned Hollow can also work. You put Thorned Hollow up front. Thorned Hollow is the big tank, kills the backliners, and then Architect kills the frontliners, and maybe you have an Animus of Will in the backline. In terms of priority spells, Glimmer for AoE. AoE is the ticket here, and it will certainly make a difference with every single Seraph fight. Wildwood Tome, making either your sweep unit or Penumbra quick, is always going to be very useful. And then as you are likely to get a sweep unit or some other unit that, even like Crucible Collector, will take advantage of Razor Sharp Edge with the extra damage. So a lot of units you can use Razor Sharp Edge in, even on Penumbra, right? If you use that like 4 or 5 times, now he's got like 150 damage that he's doing. So Razor Sharp Edge is a pretty high priority spell in these picks. In terms of artifacts, Emblem of Exile is always going to be a premium. It's one of the best relics in the game, if not the best relic in the game. So that's priority 1. And then Thorn Fruit, just for the extra free draw and damage. Stygian Guard. Here, Gorge, or not Gorge, Incanting is quite good with this build because you can fit a lot of units. So things like Guardian Stone, Siren of the Sea, Nameless Siren are all going to be fantastic in an Architect build because you can fit so many of them and without having to do any kind of overstacking shenanigans. If you don't get one of them, Titan Sentry can also be good. And what I would recommend is you do a 2-floor setup with Titan Sentry on a lower floor and then Architect plus your Gorger on a higher floor. Titan Sentry will take out the backliners, and then your Gorger plus your Architect is there for the relentless fights. In terms of spells, again, it's all about getting access to those backliners. So Ice Storm, Ice Tornado, Titan's Tooth. And then if you're going to be incanting, Offering Token is a premium for any type of incant deck. In terms of priority artifacts, again, if you're going incant focus, Founding Seal is just absolutely crazy. And if you're not incanting, or even if you are incanting, Titan's Claws is also quite good. You can get a really, really high cost spell, something like Excavation Explosion, or even like Gem Trove. You put Permafrost on it, and suddenly it's free. So yeah, Titan's Claws is also very, very good with Umbra and in general with Stygian Guard as well. Finally, Melting Remnant. So interesting, Melting Remnant has the possibility of having your Penumbra die over and over again. And the reason why that's valuable is that every time he dies and comes back, he adds more capacity. The summon trigger hits again. So what I would recommend, and this is a kind of a fun build to do, is you get something like you play your Architect, you get Wickless Baron, you get Big Sludge, and then maybe you have some tomb units like Molten Encasement or Entombed Explosion. And then you let your Penumbra die at least once, and then you bring him back over and over and over again. Or if you have Wickless Recruitment, you bring him back one time and then remove his burnout. He's going to get some extra health, get some extra damage, but mostly he's going to add a lot more capacity onto that floor. And you can really get a lot of value out of those harvest triggers. So yeah, this actually ends up working quite good. If you can't get a Wicked Blaze or a Molded, Remnant Pact is always good as well. He'll just get Endless, then you can bring him back as many times as you want. In terms of priority artifacts, for me, it's again all about that AoE. Exploding Candle is a fantastic way to get AoE. All you need is something like a Draft or any Reform unit, and suddenly you're doing 5 damage to the backline, which is usually enough to kill most backliners. Apart from that, Mold Braces tends to be really good. You can have your Architect Penumbra die, adding some extra armor onto your Big Sludge or your Wickless Baron. And then later on into the fights, you can start getting those tomb units out there, or Drafts, or whatever else you have as your chump blockers, and they're going to add a lot of armor onto your units. In general, again, Architect is all about taking advantage of that extra space. That can be with Harvest, that can be with Incanting, that can be getting a sweep unit, or extra Rage, Transcendent. A lot of different options, but it's all about the best you can do to get take advantage of that extra capacity. Okay, next up is Monstrous Penumbra. So Monstrous Penumbra has text Trample. It's a 40 damage, 25 health unit, and it has 1 extra capacity to place. At rank 2, that capacity increases from 4 to 5. The damage doubles up to 80 damage. The health also doubles up to 50 damage. At rank 3, the capacity increases to capacity 6. It has double plus extra damage, putting it to 170 damage and 100 health. So talking about strengths and weaknesses, strengths, it has extremely high base damage, very, very high base damage. It also has a kind of innate backline access using trample. So as long as you're doing more damage than the front enemy unit, you're pretty much going to clear the floor, or at least hit the second unit, or maybe even all 3 units without killing them all. But yeah, typically you're going to be able to clear most floors once you get enough damage. It also has a lot, or has a high base health as well. So 100 base health is a lot for a unit, especially for a unit that also does so much damage. On the weaknesses, has no innate sustain, so you're going to have to find a way to keep it alive, and it has very high capacity. So starting at rank 1, it's 4, then it goes to 5, then it goes to 6. That means that you're going to have to find a way to increase capacity at rank 3, or else you can't even play it on any of the floors. Opportunities, extremely high benefit from multi-strike. Yeah, I mean, multi-strike means that you get that trample effect twice. Very, very easy to clear out entire floors with 1 extra multi-strike. It also benefits a lot from quick for the same reason. You can clear a floor before it has a chance to even hit you. It also gets pretty good benefit from rage and damage buffs. That's just true of all trample and sweep units. They use buffs more, or they get more value out of these kinds of buffs than other units typically do. In terms of defensive options, lifesteal is going to be better than regen, which is going to be better than damage, shield, and armor. Again, the main reasons being, with an insanely high health total like that and such high damage, Penumbra will heal himself to full if he hits, or if he lifesteals 1 time. And regen is also pretty good on him because you can stack a lot of it. He's got a lot of health total. If you get something like 30 regen, he can withstand most damage from most bosses. Damage and armor shield are not bad either, but you get less value out of them than you do with lifesteal and regen. In terms of threats, capacity constraints, it's going to be a basically mandatory capacity artifact. So you have to get one either from, you can get something like the capacity relic for Umbra, which adds 2 capacity to the middle floor, or you have to get it from one of the bosses. Or if you're really wanting to be risky, you can also try to get it from a spell, but I would recommend that you just have that base capacity from the beginning. Otherwise, you can't play your Penumbra, and if you can't play him, that's a lot of value you're missing out on until you can get all the way through your deck and back to him again. Also consider Seraph the Patient melee weakness. He can get burst out pretty easily from Seraph the Patient. Even with lifesteal, if you have Seraph the Patient with something like 30 damage, melee weakness, and then 1 unit's going to hit him, it's very easy to just have him get burst out and killed. So be very cautious. Outside of that, there's not too many weaknesses, threats to him. Moving into tactical tips. So Monstrous Penumbra is a hybrid tank and damage carry with potential backline access via trample. He's one of the only champions that you can actually have him solo every single floor, and he doesn't actually require a lot of support to do that. Really, he just needs some form of sustain and potentially multi-strike, and then he can solo. You don't have to have any other units. You just solo with Monstrous Penumbra. Used to be even easier in the past when Void Binding was not nerfed as it is now. You could literally just run a deck by re-rolling until you get Void Binding, duplicate your Void Binding a bunch, and just put it onto Monstrous Penumbra, and you could win the run. It's not possible anymore, but certainly he still can solo carry an entire run. The nice thing is that he's quite flexible. You can use him as a burst damage to front enemy units. You can also use him as cleanup. What I would recommend is that you do a 2-floor setup. You have 1 floor that's basically just him with maybe a chump blocker or 2, and then you have a support floor who is doing either cleanup if it's a kind of AoE oriented, or if you have a heavy burst unit, then you can use him to clear the rest of the health on that unit and clear the backline. So either way works. You can either have him lower or higher. He's quite flexible. Basically, Penumbra is best when you have the Ember Drain package, because every single one of the Ember Drain cards works really well with him. And then you just have to know that with Ember Drain package comes Ember Drain, and you need to be able to play around it. Specific deck building, yeah, it's not gonna be that different. It's basically all of the standard Gorgers. I prefer the ones that have more sustain over the ones that do more damage, personally. But, I mean, any of the Gorgers are going to be just fine here. What you can do is something like you have your Penumbra on a low floor, you have your Crucible Collector, Crucible Warden, just building up lots and lots of sustain, getting ready for relentless combat. Same Shadow Eater, you do the reverse. So Shadow Eater you put on a lower floor and you get Penumbra ready for relentless. Morsel Master is going to be great with any of these types of builds. Overgorger can also be quite good. What you can do even is have Overgorger gorge all the way up through ring 7, and then in ring 8 you somehow get him behind your Penumbra. So either you do it via Cave-In, or maybe you get Dripfall or Healing Descent or Restoring Retreat. But somehow get Overgorger behind your Penumbra, and then you have all that health total that they have to get through, and Overgorger is going to do insane amounts of damage. And then, of course, Shadow Siege. For the same we talked about with Architect. If you can play him, get him. If you can't play him, don't get him. I would not get him. I should actually make this note. I would not get Shadow Siege speculatively, meaning if you don't have several of the pieces already in place, especially in terms of getting enough Ember, don't take Shadow Siege. It just becomes a dead weight, and you cannot guarantee you're going to get your Ember generators. But if you start with an Ember generator, or you have an artifact that generates Ember, then Shadow Siege can work. In terms of priority spells, Furnace Tap, number 1, absolutely. Getting a Furnace Tap on a Monstrous Penumbra is not necessarily game-winning, but it certainly makes it a lot easier. Immortal Trade is also very, very good, because lifesteal is very, very good on Monstrous Penumbra. It is slightly less valuable when you have Furnace Tap, but I would still get both. Just get both of them. Get Furnace Tap, double stack it. Maybe get Permafrost on it if you're really concerned about Ember Drain. Get Immortal Trade, double stack it, -1. You're going to get 8 lifesteal every time you play it. You're going to be just fine. Void Binding can work if you don't have Immortal Trade. I would pick one. I would not do both. You typically don't want Damage Shield and lifesteal because they kind of negate each other. So in that case, just pick one and go all in on that one. So with Void Binding, you're going to need a -1 cost. I would not double stack it or stack stone it because it's difficult. Unless you have really consistent Ember generation, then you can consider stack stone. But normally I just -1 so that it's free and you can guarantee you can play it. Perils of Production, get holdover on it. Then you have Ember to play through any types of garbage. You get has any garbage that gets in your deck, or if you need to be able to play out other spells. Perils of Production with holdover gives you that Ember. Ember Cache does the same. And then Space Prism, if you can get extra capacity, chump blockers are really, really good with Penumbra, and especially chump blockers that can, also grant something to your Penumbra are going to be really helpful. So Space Prism I find quite good in these builds. But really it's all about the Ember Drain package. If you get the Ember Drain package, even not the full Ember Drain package, even if you don't get Furnace Tap, getting a lot of Immortal Trades is going to really carry you through almost the entire run. In terms of priority artifacts, Mind Jacks. Mind Jacks means you no longer have to take a capacity relic, so get it. If it's an option, even over every other option, Mind Jacks is just too good in a Monstrous Penumbra when you have limited capacity already. Refined Void is also very good. You get 2 lifesteal at the very beginning. That guarantees that your Monstrous Penumbra will likely survive the first few rounds without getting in any danger at all. Hell's Banners, if you can play morsels out, and then out of those morsels gain Ember through Hell's Banners, that will help out a lot with all the Ember Drain issues. Light's Gift is also very useful. So if you get Light's Gift, you can put your Penumbra on the top floor, and you never have to worry about him taking any damage until the Relentless Combat. And he'll get a free hit on the boss during Relentless Combat, so that helps out a lot too. In terms of secondary clans, starting with Hellhorned, Transcend Imp, Welder Helper, Molting Imp. In this case, you really do need to add capacity. But if you have the imp set up, it can be really, really valuable. If you don't have imps, the other thing you can do is get demons and then ascend them behind the Penumbra. But in my opinion, getting those imps and adding extra space with Crucible Extension or Space Prism is going to be really valuable. In In terms of spells, if you are going imps, important work is like really awesome. It's how you can also deal with Ember Drain. So even if you can't play your imps on the floor with your Penumbra, if you could put them on another floor like above it, then you have a target for important work, which can generate Ember when you're filled with Ember Drain after using the Ember Drain package on your Penumbra. Branding Right's also very good as a way to just get extra armor. Even though armor's not that great, it's still very useful. Something like Branding Right adding 20 armor can be really useful. And it has that flexibility where you can use it to kill off things and gain shields from it. March of Shields is also pretty good. It allows you, if you have the chance, for example, to cave in, then you can put whatever you want up front, and you could even put blockers in front of Penumbra to take more advantage of his high damage throughout relentless combat. In terms of artifacts, Consume Crown is amazing. Your Penumbra is going to kill a lot of stuff. Every time he kills something, he gets more damage. It's going to be very useful. And if you are having so many imps, then Queen's Tail becomes quite good. A close third would be Ashes of the Fallen. If you have that many imps, then getting double summon triggers can be really useful. For Awoken, for me, it's like Vine Mother. Vine Mother is surprisingly good in these builds. It's a zero cost. It creates a zero cost spell that does damage and draws, which tends to be one of the weaknesses with a lot of these decks. You have to take, for example, Capacity. So then not being able to have that draw can put you in some difficult situations. But putting Vine Mother out there means that you can still get that draw, and you have something that can do damage to protect your units, and you have it's zero cost, so you don't have to worry about all the Ember Drain. Outside of that, Animus of Speed as a cleanup unit tends to be pretty good. You can put it on the top floor. It can also, if you have something like Seraph the Chaste or Seraph the Temperate, you can split Seraph's triggers between the two floors by putting Animus of Will or Animus of Speed up top, and then it will kill anything that's created by Seraph. Animus of Will can also work. It's not as good because it doesn't have quick, so it could die. But if you give health stones to it, then it should survive, and it can kill most units like that as well. Do a good cleanup. Husk Hermit as well as a good cleanup unit. In terms of priority spells, Ingraft tends to be really good. It's a way to generate Ember, so you make it zero cost. Then you're getting one Ember out of it, so even if you're fully Ember drained, you can still play it. Unleash the Wildwood is really, really good. If you don't have lifesteal, or if you don't have a way to stack like damage shield or something like that, Unleash the Wildwood with holdover means that no matter how much damage your Penumbra takes, he'll have full health in the next fight all the way up until Relentless. It's not as good during Relentless, but as a way to just make sure he's got full health at every stage, it works really well. And then Wildwood Tome, getting him quick is always going to be good. In terms of artifacts, Emblem of the Exiles, again, just adding more health to him is going to be good. And Sap Tap, very likely you have some type of healing in the deck. Sap Tap will give you that extra draw, which can be really, really beneficial for you. For Stygian Guard, again, it's about clearing, either cleanup or really in this case, it's about cleanup. So getting Titan Sentry on a lower floor or Titan Sentry on a higher floor than Penumbra allows you to clean up all of the units that don't die to Penumbra. Cold Cilia does the same thing. And then Cuddle Hex actually is pretty good. So Cuddle Hex allows you to get your Ember Drain cards frozen. So in case you don't want to get Ember Drain right at the beginning, you can get a bunch of them frozen and then play them in a more convenient time in the future. And it's quite easy to just fit on a top floor above Penumbra. In terms of spells, Frenzied Swarm. Man, getting a holdover Frenzied Swarm means that basically your Penumbra never gets hit until Relentless Combat. And even during Relentless Combat, he gets another hit. If you combine that with Light's, what is it called? The Light's Gift, then you can get 2 days onto the enemy boss before they can hit you. So Frenzied Swarm tends to be pretty good. It's also a way to get rid of garbage that you might get in your hand. So if you get all of your Ember Drain cards and they're all basically zero cost, you still have the issue with any time you get Blights in your deck. Frenzied Swarm can eliminate any issues with Blights. Offering Token for the same reason. Preserve for the same reason as Cuddle Hex. Being able to play your Ember Drain cards when you want is incredibly valuable to preserve your Ember until the time when you're okay to start getting Ember Drained. And then Siren Song also, I mean, just not have to fight, right? Like, especially if you're stacking lifesteal, Siren Song becomes valuable because then you're not wasting lifesteal on units. You just Siren Song them up to the pyre, they die to the pyre, and you preserve some lifesteal on your Penumbra. In terms of artifacts, Titan's Claws, if you're going to do so much Permafrost, and I would recommend you do Permafrost on a lot of the priority Ember Drain cards, then you can make them free with Titan's Claws. It's very, very good. Outside of that, Kinstone Totem, if you take Frenzied Swarm or Offering Token, probably more Offering Token, or if you have any other types of discards, you're going to get a lot of value out of the triggers getting some Ember. And finally, Melting Remnant. So you can reform Monstrous Penumbra. The only issue is as long as you have enough burnout extension, but I would not recommend it. Typically, it's very easy to get 7 or 8 turns of combat with Penumbra, and it can be quite difficult to get that much burnout on him. So instead, I would recommend getting extra space or even getting Dripfall and trying to get Tomb units or something else down there. What can also be really valuable is if you can get, let's say you get your Monstrous Penumbra on the middle floor, you play a Harvest unit above, so Wickless Baron, Big Sludge, and then you Dripfall them behind or cave in them behind. Then they're going to get all of the triggers from the Penumbra killing off the entire floor. And you can get really, really strong Harvest units that way. Otherwise, increase the space enough that you can fit a Tomb unit. You can have an endless Tomb unit and just get Molten Encasement or Entombed Explosive running every turn, blocking the hits, and also doing some damage or getting some stealth onto Penumbra. In terms of spells, Wickless Recruitment is really, really valuable for Ember Drain decks because it removes all of the Ember Drain, same with Resin Removal. So those are like primo picks. It means that you can play all your Ember Drain cards without ever worrying about the effect of Ember Drain. And they also tend to help with several of the other Seraphs as well. So Seraph the Temperament, Seraph the Patient, you can remove then the melee weakness or sap, and basically remove any issues of having your Penumbra get affected by any of those debuffs. And then Engulfed in Smoke, if you can hit more turns because you have stealth, that's always going to be good. If you get Engulfed in Smoke, you really should prioritize making it 0 cost if you have the Ember Drain package. Dripfall as well to just get units behind the Penumbra to then, or vice versa. If you have a big tank, if you have something like, Legion of Wax, then you can actually put Penumbra behind Legion of Wax and take advantage of all of that chunkiness blocking the Penumbra. In terms of artifacts, Flicker's Liquor is amazing. Flicker's Liquor lets you play morsels, and then those morsels make spells free, which is really, really good when you have Ember Drain decks. It also works. The Flicker's Liquor can also hit Blights. And then Waxer Snuffer. Oftentimes you're going to get things that, like these Tomb units. Getting a Waxer Snuffer is going to double their effect. Okay. So again, Monstrous Penumbra, it's all about building around Penumbra. He is your carry. Get the Ember Drain package and then use your secondary clan to enable that Ember Drain package to work the best it can, or to support Penumbra as best you can. So he is the carry. There's not going to be many units that you're going to want to prioritize over him in terms of protecting and buffing. And the final Penumbra path, we have Glutton. So Glutton is the Gorge or George, the Penumbra. He is a 20 health, 20 damage unit with text Lifesteal 2 and Gorge plus 4 damage, plus 2 health. At rank 2, the Gorge increases to plus 9 and plus 4 health, plus 9 damage, plus 4 health. And at rank 3, the Gorge increases to plus 15 damage and plus 6 health. So main strengths of Glutton, he has incredibly high scaling health and incredibly high scaling damage. And he has some mild sustain. He starts with 2 lifesteal, so it's as long as you can get him enough health by the time the enemies reach his floor, which typically means the top floor. We'll talk about that in a little bit. He can sustain through 2 waves of enemies without dying. And that gives him some time to scale up. In terms of weaknesses, he has very low base health, very low base damage compared to the other Penumbras and in general. And he still has that high capacity requirement. So certainly not as bad as with the Monstrous Penumbra, but it's certainly more than any other champion, except for like Wild Intent and some of the others. In terms of opportunities, he benefits quite a lot from multi-strike. His damage is going to get really high, and with high damage, multi-strike then doubles that high damage. Same with Trample. You get high damage with Glutton, and then he will spread that damage across the whole floor as long as he's killing the front enemy unit. He has a moderate benefit from Quick. He can usually kill the front enemy unit with Quick, which is sometimes valuable. And then in terms of defense, lifesteal is going to be better than damage shield, which is better than regen and armor. The main reason I put damage shield a little bit better in this case is because you're often going to get it with morsels, and it's quite easy to stack lots and lots of damage shield with morsels using something like Shroud Spike. In terms of threats, he is gorge dependent, so if you have no morsel generation or little morsel generation, it can be very difficult for him to scale properly. He's also very weak to sweep, not him himself, but the Morsel Maker, Morsel Master, and the morsels themselves are all very weak to sweep. And if they die, it kills your growth engine. So just be careful about that. That with sweep, especially something like Seraph the Chaste, where he has Ember Drain sweep, that can kill off your damage morsel before it has a chance to get gorged. Also relatively weak to spikes. Best way to get around that is to always play on the top floor at Covenant ranks 10 or higher. Then your morsels come out stunned, so they're not going to die to spikes. But if you're playing on a lower floor, just be cautious because your morsels can die to spikes, and then you're not getting benefit from the gorge. And Seraph the Patient's melee weakness. This is typically the biggest problem I have with George the Penumbra, is that he dies to Seraph the Patient so often, even before it gets to Relentless, right? So, in fact, by the time it's Relentless, he's scaled up. It's having him survive until Relentless tends to be really tricky with this build because you have to frontline with him, but he has so little health at the beginning. So what's the role of George the Penumbra? Well, he's a hybrid tank and damage carry with incredibly high scalability due to gorge triggers. As both his damage and health scale with gorging, it's almost always best to play him on the top floor. You give him plenty of time to gorge, scale up before Relentless combat, or even before early combat. Typically, you want one other support floor. So either you want something that can clear the back line, like a sweep unit, or a Titan Sentry, or anything with spikes, something like that. And then, or spells to do that if you don't have a support floor. Alternatively, you can burst, so you can get like a strong, heavy hitting frontliner lower, and then Penumbra and Morsel Master / Morsel Maker can act as cleanup. That can also work. And then, as I mentioned, Seraph the Patient can be especially difficult. What happens? The biggest problem is that you can have it like second turn. Seraph goes up there and puts melee weakness onto Penumbra, and Seraph's base damage is 20. Penumbra's health is 20. He'll just kill. You can't block it either. Unless you have damage shield, he'll just die, which is really, honestly, very frustrating how that's set up right now. But just be very, very cautious around Seraph the Patient and prioritize getting damage shield. That will save you. If you can get any type of damage shield, it's going to make your life so much better against Seraph the Patient. If you don't have it, there's a huge risk that you'll just die right up front. What can also help is if you can, first turn, play 2 floor and put Seraph the Patient on the floor where Seraph is. There's a chance you can block with something and then keep him alive. But again, it's still quite difficult to keep him alive those first few turns. In terms of deck building, priority units, Morsel Master, Morsel Maker. You not need them, but they're going to tremendously help how much your Gorge Penumbra is scaling. Outside of that, getting secondary support with another Gorge floor can work. It's pretty easy to get enough morsels to fill up 2 floors. So then something like Shadow Eater becomes really valuable to clear the back lines, or even Crucible Collector, Crucible Warden to hit the front line quite hard and then do cleanup with Penumbra. And then, of course, as I said, with Shadow Siege, if you can play him take him, play him, and profit. Priority spells. Number 1 is Shroud Spike. Shroud Spike is so good with Gorge Penumbra. And now that you can actually minus cost on it, I would do it. So what you do, I would say that the 2 best ways to play it are consume remove, -1, get it back to 0, and then you can just play it every time it comes up. Or you can even, if you don't want to remove consume from it, you can -2 cost to it, and that will add 2 additional stacks. And you can easily get something like a 3, or then your 3 Ember Shroud Spike becomes a 5 Ember Shroud Spike, giving you 10 Gorges, which is massive with rank 3 Penumbra. That's 150 health, or sorry, 150 damage, and I believe it is 60 health, which is absolutely nuts. After Shroud Spike, then it's everything that's going to give you more gorging. Shroud Mitosis allows you to triple a morsel on a floor. Wretch allows you to get morsels you've already consumed back into your hand and back into the front. Packed Morsels allows you to get 3 free morsels at 0 cost. And then Grovel allows you the dual purpose of being able to get damage shield on Penumbra as well as get more gorging. And then with Gorge the Penumbra, I keep saying it like that. With Gorge Penumbra, Feast is also quite valuable. Oftentimes you'll have more morsels than you can spend. So then being able to get Feast in there, feast a floor, and then place more morsels means that you can get even more Gorge effects. Priority artifacts, Fossilized Fangs, hands down, number 1, get it and profit. Outside of that, then it's all about consistency with morsel generation. So, and Abandoned Umbra is the most consistent because you get it no matter what. Shade Lamp is also quite good if you're consistently killing units. And then Wing Technology. So the main reason why you get Wing Technology is to avoid that situation I mentioned where sweep units are killing your morsels. If you get Wing Technology, then the morsels come out with damage shield, and you don't have to worry about them getting killed by sweep or spikes. In terms of secondary clans, starting with Hellhorned. For me, you can get a lot of value out of Imps again, especially Pyre Chomper is probably the best one. If you can get Shroud Spike and then you have Pyre Chomper, that's just getting more effects out of your Shroud Spike. And then in general, because you have so much Ember-related stuff, and you're probably not going to go much Ember Drain, at least I wouldn't recommend doing a lot of Ember Drain with this particular build. Then you're going to take advantage. It's an easy way to get easy way to get Shadow Siege out. It's also a good way to get something like Consumer of Crowns out, or being able to play some of the more expensive Umbra spells. Outside of that, Molting Imp is also pretty good as a way to just clear backliners, and then Transcendent benefits from any Imp synergies you have. Important Work is typically very good. Vent can be really good for backline clearing. Impolate can also be quite good if you need to kill off Imps. And one thing you can also do, as I mentioned with Seraph the Patient, is if you get a chump blocker, that eliminates a lot of the issues. So if you have something like a Molting Imp or a Pyre Chomper, you can play it in front of Penumbra. It then takes all the hits, and then it dies, and then you still gorge with Penumbra. It could be really good. In terms of artifacts, Unbroken Horn tends to be really good because you want to get the most out of that Shroud Spike or out of those Umbra spells. Impsicle to get more Imps. Almost every Imp is going to be pretty good in this deck. If you can get even Impish Scholar to bring back your Shroud Spikes, it's also really good. And then Ashes of the Fallen. If you have so many summon things happening, might as well double those summon triggers. In terms of Awoken, for me, again, Vine Mother ends up being really good. It's a way to get free draw every turn. Husk Hermit is a way to sweep and clear the back line. Wilting Sapwood is another way to generate a lot of Ember, which then you can translate into your X costs, especially Shroud Spike. And then Thorn Hollow, similar to Husk Hermit, as a way to clear the back line. Vine Mother also has the benefit that you can, if you play on the second floor instead, you put Vine Mother on top, then Vine Mother can do cleanup duty with her stings that she's generating. And yeah, Wilting Sapwood can actually be really good in this deck. If you get Endless on it, it'll typically earn its own Ember back, and then you can use it to get a lot of Ember for a huge Shroud Spike. In terms of priority spells, Engraft, again, for the draw and for the, mostly for the Ember, being able to generate Ember. Wildwood Tome to get quick out, and then Root Seeds to increase the damage on, and actually what I typically do is use Root Seeds on your Morsel Master, Morsel Maker, so that you can get more damage out of them. Your Penumbra is going to scale up enough. The Root Seeds is there for the draw and to get a secondary damage unit out of your Morsel Master, Morsel Maker. In terms of priority artifacts, Emblem of Exiles, it's going to go right onto Penumbra, increasing his health, and then Thorn Fruit for the draw and extra damage. For Stygian Guard, you can do a kind of dual setup here. So what works out quite well is if you have one floor, which is your incant floor, and then one floor, which is a gorge floor. I think I talked about this during Tethys overview. But yeah, so you have your Penumbra on the top. You have your middle floor be your incant floor. You play your morsel generating spells on the middle floor, except for the ones that are like, Shroud Spike or Shroud Mitosis. But if you have like Shade Splitter or Making a Morsel or something like that, you play it on the floor where you have your incanters, and then you place the morsels on your gorge floor. It tends to work pretty well. Titan Sentry is also quite good because you can clear a floor before it reaches Penumbra. Also saves you some damage on Penumbra. And then in terms of spells, it's all about basically killing off units as best you can or preventing damage onto Penumbra. So that means Frenzied Swarm, Titan's Tooth. So Frenzied Swarm for the Daze, Titan's Tooth to clear off backliners, Ice and Pyre to kill frontliners, Siren Song to avoid the combat altogether. Anything that's going to be keeping that top floor safe is going to benefit you. In terms of priority artifacts, if you are going to incant and do this kind of incant gorge setup, then Founding Seal is a priority, number one, to double all those incant triggers. And then if you get something like Frenzied Swarm or even Offering Token or any other discards, then Kinstone Totem can help generate Ember and can even help generate Ember again to try to get huge Shroud Spikes out. And finally, Melting Remnant. So with Melting Remnant, what I typically do is a 2-floor setup where you have your Gorge floor and then you have your Harvest floor. And what's nice about having the Harvest floor is that morsels can also be harvested. So then you can, if you have excess morsels, which you're often going to have excess morsels, you can play the excess morsels in front of your harvest units, and then when the morsels die, you get all that harvest trigger. What's also cool about that is that you can then reform those morsels, and on another turn, when you don't get like a natural morsel generator, you can still molded get a reformed morsel and put it on the floor where you're gorging. You can also get some really thick morsels that way. If you have a morsel only floor and nothing's gorging them, you can just like grow them infinitely with molds, which is kind of hilarious as well. So then, yeah, if you're going to do Harvest, then Wickless Baron, Big Sludge are your 2 big Harvest units. Entombed Explosive becomes very, very good as a way to protect those Harvest units as well as do big damage to the front enemy units. Remnant Pact is quite good. So one thing you can do with Remnant Pact is Gorge Penumbra keeps all of his stats. So if you end up getting Remnant Pact or if you get Votive Key, you can play him on a low floor, gorge up a bunch, and then he'll die and come right back endless with all of his stats on a second floor and on a third floor. Engulfed in Smoke also tends to be pretty good as a way to protect Penumbra. Molded as a way to bring back morsels or bring back units to put in front of your Harvest floor. And then Sacred Wicks for the same reason. In terms of priority artifacts, Flicker's Liquor as a way to get really, really good benefit out of the morsels you're creating and out of the tomb units you're using. And then finally, for AoE, Exploding Candle becomes really good. If you're going to be molding a lot, then those morsels actually can do AoE. Just note that when they're gorged, they don't trigger Exploding Candle. They actually have to die. So if they're getting gorged, they're not dying in the same way, so they don't trigger Exploding Candle. But on your Harvest floor, those reformed morsels can then trigger Exploding Candle. In general, this whole build, again, your Penumbra is your carry, but he's not really that good at just soloing everything. So then it's about getting a second floor, typically one that can do AoE. It's pretty easy to kill off frontliners with Penumbra because his damage scales quite well. The biggest problem is getting to the back line. So then if any kind of AoE you can get, any kind of support floor is going to help to make sure that you're not getting a lot of leaks with units getting to the pyre. Okay, then getting into Penumbra's upgrade path flexing and my rankings. So when it comes to flexing, honestly, Penumbra is not really great at flexing. All rank 3 upgrades add so much additional value that it's hard to justify not just taking the 3rd rank of the upgrade path you're on instead of getting something extra. I mean, you might consider something like adding Monstrous Trample, but with the Gorge Penumbra, with you end up taking up more space, making it harder to gorge properly. If you try to flex in Architect, that can kind of work with Monstrous, but it's not as good. You're missing out on a lot of damage, like almost 100 damage worth if you flex in Architect, which is not super great. And similarly, that last upgrade with Architect, getting that extra capacity becomes really valuable. And as well, the amount of damage you're getting on top plus the trample, it's not as much as just taking that 3rd upgrade path. So in general, my recommendation with Penumbra, stick to 1 upgrade path and go all the way through rank 3. In terms of my prioritization, I typically go with Monstrous. I think it's much more reliable and consistent. Monstrous doesn't really need much to succeed in most runs. Architect and Glutton I put on about equal. Architect is certainly much better as a support unit. Glutton is much better as a carry. Both of them have issues sometimes getting enough damage out or surviving, where Monstrous typically is a little bit more consistent on both counts. But all 3 are also pretty good. There's not one that's like a clear worst case here. Some people say Architect, but I actually find Architect to be really good. If you have that setup like I mentioned, where you have a Gorger up front, you put Architect, Penumbra behind the Gorger, and then you're still able to fit other units, that is a really strong setup. It's hard to lose that setup. So, in general, Penumbra is really good. All 3 upgrade paths are pretty good, but for my money, I think Monstrous is the most consistent. All right, we're on to the final champion of the OGs, Melting Remnant Rector Flicker. Lore for Rector Flicker. Both priest and gang leader, Rector Flicker has taken advantage of the Armageddon at hand and played the Reform and the Wickless off each other, creating an endless cycle of profit through deceit. I don't agree much with his methods, but his charm is hard to ignore. So he kind of has this gangster style setup, right? So he's like pulling strings, manipulating people, and trying to get both the Wickless and the Reformed to do exactly what he wants through deceit and charm. From a design perspective, he's got these 2 big flails, flaming flails, and he is certainly a more on like the Wickless side, but yeah, he's a big candle man with 2 big flails. So let's look at his gameplay, his different upgrade paths, and see how much they capitalize on this like gangster setup here. So first you have Burn Bright. So Burn Bright is really like big, heavy, beefy dude ready to fight. I don't know how much that fits that idea of him kind of more deceit and charm oriented style. This is more like what you would expect as an enforcer for a gangster, not the gangster himself, but I think it's okay. The idea is that then you have this big, beefy gangster lord who is intimidating everybody with his sheer strength and will. Then you have the Accumulator, who is harvesting and gaining and becoming bigger and bigger and bigger as both friendly and enemy units die. I kind of like this one. I think that definitely fits that theme of him just like manipulating people into doing what he wants and then just getting stronger and stronger and stronger as they are fighting each other. And then last we have Dark Calling. Dark Calling is a resolve trigger. As you resolve, his resolve is that he reforms 2 random enemy units and applies extra damage to them. I can kind of also see this as well as kind of like the behind the scenes gangster who is bringing back his guys and getting them back into the fights and It's more of like this support, coordination, tactical guy who is manipulating his people into fighting for him. So I think Burn Bright, kind of from a design perspective, doesn't fit the lore as much as the other two, but all three definitely have their kind of different play style. Certainly out of the original champions, I think has the most diverse play style across all three upgrade paths. But enough about design. Let's jump into deck building, starting with Burn Bright. So Burn Bright at rank 1 is a 50 damage, 50 health unit with Burn Out 3. At rank 2, he gains an additional 30 health and 30 damage. And at rank 3, he gains an additional 65 health and 65 damage. So he's just a big, beefy dude who has a timer on him. So from a strength perspective, his high base health, high base damage, even starting at rank 1, is very strong. It's if you can keep him alive from a burnout perspective, then he'll beat every boss up through rank 3 on his own. So he has enough damage scaling to kill all of the first 3 ring bosses. The big issue, and it's also a strength there, is that he has innate burnout. So the main good thing about having innate burnout is that when you reform him, he starts out at 4 after reform rather than 3. So if you do have to reform him, you're going to get a lot more value out of the reform than you would on any other champion. And as well, that burnout scaling can become really valuable. You get something like a Paraffin Enforcer. Paraffin Enforcer immediately starts to benefit Burn Bright with Rage. In terms of weaknesses, he has no innate backline access. He has no innate damage scaling apart from like reform and burnout scaling. And he has no innate sustain. He does have innate burnout as well. So if you don't have any way to reform him, I don't know why I said remnant there. It should be reform. Or if you don't have any burnout applicators, you have a 3-turn death timer. So if you don't get something on him within 3 turns, he just dies, unless you can reform him. And that can be very, very problematic. In general, my recommendation is before you take Burn Bright, you really need to have a burnout applicator or a reform, or else you're just asking to be sad. When it comes to opportunities, then, he has a very high benefit from all burnout applicators and from burnout extension. He also has a high benefit from multi-strike, trample, and a moderate benefit from quick. And the reason I have asterisks here is there is an important qualification here. Applying multi-strike, trample, and quick, it's not carried over when the unit dies. They're considered as buffs, and buffs get removed when the unit dies and gets reformed. So multi-strike, trample, and quick, they're all pretty good, especially multi-strike and trample. But be very cautious that you don't apply them and then let him die, because on reform, he will not keep those buffs. And then in terms of defense, lifesteal for me is the preferred over regen, and then regen over damage, shield, and armor. That makes sense because he's a high damage dealer with high health. That fits lifesteal and regen a lot more. Damage, shield, and armor, of course, are good, but you're not going to get as much value out of each tick compared to lifesteal and regen. Comes to threats, biggest threat is his lack of burnout extension. Apart from that, he doesn't really have any major threats. When it comes to like Seraph the Patient, if you have reform that already counters Seraph the Patient, okay, fine, Seraph the Patient killed your Rector Flicker, but now he's coming back stronger with more burnout. When it comes to Temperance, it's kind of the same deal. He has already really high damage. That sap is not going to drop him down to the point where he's in any real danger. The same with, let's see, Chaste. Yeah, Chaste doesn't affect him at all unless you are doing like a rage build. And even then, it's pretty easy to overcome the Chaste's cleanse. And he has raw damage anyway that's already quite high. You don't necessarily need to rely on rage to win. So yeah, it's really just about if you can get his burnout extended or you have consistent reform, you'll be happy. Otherwise, it's a sad time. So what does that mean in terms of tactical tips? Well, he is a hybrid tank and damage carry. He has very high base stats for the cost of 3 burnout. And I would say there's not really a best floor for him. I guess the only way you'd say there's a best floor is if you are specifically relying on reform. Then it typically can be good to play him on the bottom floor so that you can replay him on the middle and then top floors. But outside of that specific case, you can really play him anywhere. It's wherever you're going to get the most value out of him. Especially if you have burnout extenders, it really doesn't matter as much. With his high health, he can act as a tank. but there's also benefit having in the back line. So if you put something like a Lady of the Reformed in front of him, she'll scale up his burnout, also acts as a tank, giving him plenty of time to do lots of damage. So he's very flexible, similar to Monstrous Penumbra. You can kind of put him in the front or the back, depending on what you need. And then, just as I mentioned, check your starter cards. If you do not have burnout extenders or reform, I would avoid Burn Bright. It's very risky. You're not guaranteed to get them. It's very likely, but you're not guaranteed. And the last thing that you want is to go into a Daedalus fight or a Talos fight without any extension on your Rector Flicker, because he'll just die so quickly. In terms of deck building, priority units, number 1 is Paraffin Enforcer. That's the core of the Enforced Burn Bright build. You have Paraffin Enforcer scaling Rage onto Rector Flicker. Lady of the Reformed is also really good as a way of extending Burnout onto your Rector Flicker. Lady of the House and Draft also fit quite nicely because they both are going to benefit from the same kind of cards that you want for Rector Flicker anyway. So they're going to benefit from Reform. They're going to benefit from Burnout extension. So getting a kind of burnout group is going to be really good. And what can be really nice, especially, is if you get like Dripfall, you can create a really big floor with like Lady of the Reformed, Paraffin Enforcer, a Draft, and then Rector Flicker, and they're all on the same floor from the Dripfall. And that becomes really powerful with all of that rage generation on burnout units. Outside of that, Molded Casement's always going to be really good as a way to protect burnout or protect Burn Bright, Rector Flicker, and any other units that are on the floor. And then Bounty Stalker. Bounty Stalker is his own carry. So certainly if you can get a Bounty Stalker and you can get all the support for him, especially because a build like this is typically going to have a lot of reform or should have reform, then Bounty Stalker fits quite nicely. In terms of priority spells, Wicklash is the number 1. Wicklash gives him extra damage, which can help with especially later fights, and gives him that extra burnout that he needs. Purifying Cleanse after the buff is certainly much better than it was before. Now it's adding an extra burnout tick per application. And if he's tanking, then Purifying Cleanse also acts as a way to heal him back after he's taken damage from each fight or each combat. Wicked Blaze, also very good. It's definitely the priority over Molded if you can get it. That extra damage, again, he can certainly make use of it, and so can the other units. If you have like Drafts, even Paraffin Enforcer, bringing back a Paraffin Enforcer with Wicked Blaze and then letting him scale himself tends to be really good. Crushing Demise, there's a really solid build you can do where if you have Crushing Demise and Molded on holdover, you can Crushing Demise your Rector Flicker. That will kill one unit. You Molded back the Rector Flicker. He kills another unit. And then you have it on holdover, and they can just infinitely scale, not infinitely, but they can scale up your Rector Flicker to the point where he's got like 10 burnout and like way more stats. That's a really, really solid build if you can manage it. Of course, you can't guarantee it, but those two in combination tend to be really strong. And then Hallowed Drippings as a kind of last case. I would also put as a close 7th is Dripfall. Dripfall tends to be really good in decks like this, where you're more wanting to stack a floor with tons of burnout units. I might even put Dripfall above Hallowed Drippings in some cases. In terms of artifacts, Combustible Wax, anything to do to keep extra burnout is going to be great. It's going to make your Wicklash apply 5 burnout. It's going to make your Purifying Cleanse apply 6 burnout. Your reforms are going to be much stronger. Just across the board, burnout decks love Combustible Wax. Fade's First Blade as well. Just native gain rage. Fantastic on a burnout deck like this. Resin Block, again, if you're going more molded heavy, especially that Crushing Demise molded deck, Resin Block is going to just make your units get insane damage levels. And then Votive Key. It's not as good, but as a last resort, you can also use Votive Key as a way to play your Rector Flicker on each floor. For example, like you play him on the first floor, he dies, you play him on the second floor, play him on the third floor, and you can guarantee that even if you don't have him molded. But and maybe I'd actually put in here this might even be a better 4th as Exploding Candle. Maybe they're tied. Exploding Candle is also really, really good because one of the problems with decks like this is often getting AoE. So having something like Exploding Candle allows you to get AoE out of your burnout units when they die. Looking at other clans, with Hellhorn, Deranged Brute. Get Deranged Brute and get your Paraffin Enforcer and Prophet. You're going to get insanely high rage damage numbers. Fledgling Imp as well, as a way to just get rage onto all your units, is going to be great. Welder Helper for protection is pretty good. If you have both Fledgling Imps and Welder Helpers or other imps, then of course getting Transcendent makes sense. But really, Deranged Brute is like the number one thing you want out of this deck. Apart from that, any unit will do, especially if you can get Burnout on them on a floor with Paraffin Enforcer. Tends to be pretty good. Any one of the units, any one of the demons is pretty good to reform, but these would be my priorities. In terms of spells, Important Work tends to be really, really good in decks like this. What's also quite good is the imps reform quite well, not only because they get their summon triggers multiple times, but they can actually get pretty thick after you've reformed them 3 or 4 times. So it's definitely not a bad idea to get something like Important Work and then combine that with like Moldeds or any type of reform is going to be really good. Apart from that, Branding Right, getting more armor is always going to be good. Alloy of the Ancients, similarly. You can also put them onto the Paraffin Enforcer himself, specifically Alloy of the Ancients, because he's pretty fragile. So getting Alloy of the Ancients on him is kind of good. Get him some more tankiness. In terms of priority artifacts, Resonant Shard, obviously getting more rage is going to be good. Collection of Tales for the same reason. There, you just need to make sure that you have enough burnout. But once you have enough burnout, then you can just scale up that rage and get a lot more value out of them. Moving on to Awoken. For me, it's getting good tanks that can hit the back line or getting sweep. In terms of units there, Thorned Hollow, and I may even switch this up a little bit. I think Animus of Will, Thorned Hollow are tied for first. Animus of Will is fantastic to reform. So you actually want her to die. If you have a reform deck, have her die, come back. She's going to love all that extra damage. And even when she burns out, you bring her back again. Really, really solid reform unit. Thorned Hollow is more as the tank. So if you want to have your Rector Flicker in the back, you put Thorned Hollow in the front. You can even heal it with the Purifying Cleanse and just get lots of stacks of spikes to kill the backliners off. Then if it dies, you bring it back. Yeah, you're a little bit sad that you lost all that health and thorns, but still a decent, okay unit to reform if you need to. And then Shattered Shell really just for the sweep. You get Shattered Shell behind your Rector Flicker. And as well, all of these, well, specifically Animus of Will and Shattered Shell also benefit a lot from Wicklash. Getting more damage and being able to scale up also through their burnout. Priority spells. Cycle of Life is really good. Getting more health and spikes onto your Rector Flicker can be really, really good for clearing the backline. Wildwood Tome with 150 base damage at rank 3 or even 50 base damage at rank 1. It's pretty common that you'll be able to kill the first unit before they have a chance to attack with Wildwood Tome. Or if you get a sweep unit or an Animus of Will, that can also be really valuable. Razor Sharp Edge. All the units you're going to take, especially the burnout units, tend to value extra damage. And as they're going to get reformed anyway, they're going to get more health back. And the nice thing about both Cycle of Life and Razor Sharp Edge is that those increases in stats are maintained across reforms. Even a Steel Enhancer is pretty good in decks like this because they are permanent. They happen. They carry through reform. In terms of artifacts, Emblem of the Exiles always. Emblem of the Exiles it's just too good. If you get it, you're going to be happy. Thorn Fruit as well for the draw and extra damage. Stygian Guard priority units. Titan Sentries, really good. It's also a pretty decent reform target. Nameless Siren, you don't want to reform her, but she is going to scale really well with the Rage, and you're going to play a lot of spells. So what you can actually do is you can put things like Wicklash onto Nameless Siren and Siren of the Sea, and they'll get the double benefit of the stat increase plus the incant trigger. And as long as you have something like a holdover on a Wicklash, they're going to scale up like crazy. So that's a really strong setup as well. If you're just using something like a Purifying Cleanse on your Rector Flicker, that's also going to incant. So incant units are typically pretty good. And then it's a lot about AoE. So Titan's Tooth, Ice Tornado, that's why you have the Titan Sentry as well. And then Frenzied Swarm just to prevent damage. Offering Token as well, if you're going to be incanting, is going to be good. Very standard incant setup. So then Founding Seal becomes really valuable. Kinstone Totem, pretty valuable, just to get more and more incants out. With Umbra, you can have a Gorge Floor. The Gorge units are not good to reform, so typically you want to have a 2-floor setup with a Gorge floor, and then separate from the Gorge floor you have your Rector Flicker floor. Rector Flicker maybe as a kind of way to soften up units, and then your Crucible Ward and Crucible Collector as your Relentless. Alternatively, you can have a Shadow Eater on a lower floor, clear the back line, and then have your Burnout floor above that, who then takes out the large health frontline units. Priority spells, Furnace Tap, Umbra Stone. Again, only in case you have enough Burnout and like Lifesteal or whatever to keep Rector Flicker alive. If he's going to die, and he's dying consistently, then put Permafrost on Furnace Tap and wait till Relentless fights. With Umbra Stone, it's really if you have Burnout and you're not reforming, because you want Umbra Stone for early parts of the fights. You don't want it for the Relentless. With Furnace Tap, you have much more flexibility because you can just Permafrost it and wait until it's time to play for Relentless, and then you go all out with your Furnace Taps and kill the bosses. In terms of artifacts, Mind Jacks, more space is good space. And then Refined Void to give you some extra sustain early on in fights. And the name of the game here is similar to the Monstrous Penumbra build. It's get your Rector Flicker to be as strong as possible, and anything that can support making him as strong as possible is going to help you win. Next up, Accumulator. So Accumulator starts off with 10 damage, 15 health, and has a Harvest Trigger, +1 damage, +5 health. At rank 2, that increases to 15 damage, 25 health base, and all of the Harvest Triggers double. And then at rank 3, similar, his stats then double, his base stats double, and his Harvest Triggers double. And it's very, very common that you can get insane health totals onto Rector Flicker in this build. So moderate damage scaling. The damage scaling is really not amazing. Even at rank 3, it's still only 4 damage per Harvest Trigger. It's really the health scaling is like insane. And he kind of has a sustain with the Harvest. So even though he's taking damage, as long as units are dying either on your side or the enemy side, he's going to kind of sustain himself by gaining all those Harvest Triggers, especially at rank 3. It's 10 health per unit that's dying. It's pretty easy to sustain through fights when you're getting that much permanent max health. Problem is that he has pretty low base stats at rank 1 and 2, so he needs support both in getting access to the back line and in killing the front line. He can't really do it on his own until after he has had significant amount of Harvest Triggers. So what do you want to do then? So giving him multi-strike certainly helps. Trample certainly helps. Both of those are going to help to access the back line and also make it more likely to kill the front line. Quick is okay, but you got to be careful with Quick because sometimes you want your units to die in front, and if you have Quick and you're killing the units before they have a chance to attack your units, you're getting less Harvest Triggers. In terms of defense, Lifesteal is going to be your number one here. It's you're going to get a lot of health, and then you're going to have a lot of damage, and Lifesteal is going to take advantage of both that high damage and high health. Then, as a secondary, regen's okay, damage, shield, and armor or whatever, they're okay. But honestly, he's going to sustain himself pretty well. You don't necessarily need to invest a lot in defense. In terms of threats, high health frontline units are going to be your biggest threat because they're going to stop you from harvesting. So really making sure that you can consistently kill the front line is one of the first priorities, and then making sure that you can kill the back line. One problem with Accumulator is even if you can handle every single Relentless fight, this is a build that often ends up leaking tons of units into your pyre, and you could die from backliners that do a lot of damage. So it's very important that you're thinking ahead of time, what cards do I need to make sure that I'm not in a situation where units are consistently getting to the pyre and are going to kill me before the bosses come out. Apart from that, Seraph the Temperate can be a little problematic. It slows down the first few kills because that first unit that comes out in Seraph the Temperate has 120 health. And getting through 120 health when all your units are sapped, when they all start with low base damage, can be a little bit tricky. So just be aware of that. It might make sense to play up on a higher floor, do a 2-floor setup, and just think about how am I going to be able to do enough damage to kill that front unit and then get access to the backliners. And the Seraph the Patient rally trigger can happen that even if you have all this health in the world, if you get picked off before you have a chance to start scaling, you lose. So with Seraph the Patient, it's really about how consistent are my chump blockers. The more chump blockers and the more consistent your chump blockers are, the less you have to worry about Seraph the Patient. And then with the rally trigger, that can also be very problematic. Typically in a build like this, you're playing a lot of units that can scale up Seraph the Patient's damage quite a lot, to the point where he is able to kill your Rector Flicker even with all of that extra health. Now, you got to think about it. He's gaining 1 damage, or no, he's getting 3 damage per rally trigger. You're getting 10 health per harvest trigger, so it kind of evens out, but just be aware. Next up, talking about his role. So Accumulator Rector Flicker is primarily a tank unit with decent damage potential. As he requires a lot of harvest triggers, typically you want to play him on the first floor of combat. That doesn't mean the first floor in general, that just means the first floor where there is combat. So if there's only one floor, you can play him on the top floor and then give yourself more time to set up, or you play on the middle floor. Normally I'm playing actually on the bottom floor, but you don't have to play him there. It's just wherever you're going to have the first deaths occurring, that's where you want him to be played. Unit order can be tricky. I recommend having him in the middle. So normally you would get something like a Big Sludge or a Wickless Baron behind, because they scale up their damage much faster. So I usually do something like you have your chump blockers in front, you have your Rector Flicker right behind your chump blockers, and then you have your damage dealers in the back. The best thing you want is 1 capacity, endless, and reformed units. Morsels also work. You just want something that can consistently fit in that 1 or 2 extra capacity up front, that are going to consistently die. Getting burnout on them as a base stat with endless can help to make sure they're going to die even when the units aren't getting attacked. But anything you can do to use the most out of like 1 or 2 capacity is going to be the best way to handle it. And then, as mentioned, you might want to have a second floor. If you are not able to kill everything on that first floor where you're playing them, that's also okay, but you need to make sure you have a backup plan, either a support floor or spells that can kill the units that get through that first floor. In terms of priority units, Remnant Host is amazing. Remnant Host is 4 harvest stacks in 1, because it spawns, I think it's 3. It spawns drafts when it dies, and then those drafts also die because of burnout. Excuse me. So that gives you a lot of harvest stacks for 1 capacity. And not only that, oftentimes they're not able to actually kill the drafts, so the drafts are also doing damage, making it more likely you're killing their units. It's just a good time. Get endless on a Remnant Host and profit. And then right after that is Wickless Baron. Wickless Baron's advantage here is that you can typically fit him with Rector Flicker without having to increase capacity too much. So you put him behind the Wickless, or you put it behind Rector Flicker. Rector Flicker is doing all the tanking for him, and then he is gaining from all of the units on your end that are dying and all the units that get killed on the enemy side. Big Sludge is also really good. The only thing with Big Sludge is that he takes up more space. He's a 3 capacity unit, so it can be hard to fit both him, Rector Flicker, and chump blockers. But he'll scale much faster. That's the advantage of Big Sludge. He scales much faster. He also has much higher base health, but he's more difficult to fit. And then you want your tomb units. Tomb units are like the key here. Molten Encasement, Tombed Explosive. And as a last resort, if you can't get a tomb unit, getting a Votavary is also quite good. The nice thing is that he has Votavary has the by default endless, so you can have her in that front lane or that front part, just getting killed every turn and scaling up your Rector Flicker and any other harvest units you have. And you're not even losing a draw for doing that, compared to other endless units where you do lose a draw. When Votavary dies, you get that draw and can then immediately play her again. In terms of spells, Remnant Pact is one of the best ones. It has 2 purposes. One, you can put it on a tomb unit to have that tomb unit keep getting coming back and then being played again, giving you more harvest triggers. You can also play it directly on Rector Flicker, because all those harvest stacks come back when he is endless. So you're not losing out on any of the extra health and damage you're getting, and then you can even repeat play him on multiple floors. That tends to be pretty good. Apart from that, Intent on Death is really good. The only one you have to be concerned about is Molten Encasement, but otherwise you typically are going to have a lot of units with Extinguish triggers, Remnant Host, Entombed Explosive, Votavary, and even with a Molten Encasement, you can still use it on Molten Encasement, but you probably want to have Burnout on the Molten Encasement to make sure that it's still going to die, even if it's not getting attacked because of the stealth. Apart from that, it's all about the reform. Molded, Sacred Wicks, Wicked Blaze, all of them are going to be really good, bringing back those units so that they can die again and continue to stack up your Rector Flicker. And then finally, as this build typically is going to have a lot of units dying, a Fatal Melting is really good. It's a way to also get backline access, which is one of the major problems with this deck. So yeah, getting a Fatal Melting in there will help consistently clear the backline for you. In terms of priority artifacts, again, you have a lot of Extinguish triggers, so Wax or Snuffer is going to be really valuable. Mold Braces is also very good. It gets even more health, effective health, with armor onto your Rector Flicker or whoever's behind the chump blockers. Flicker's Liquor tends to be really good. You're playing a lot of cheap units, molded units, free units. You can take advantage of higher cost spells using Flicker's Liquor. And then finally, Exploding Candle. You start off with Dregs. You have a lot of reform. Exploding Candle means AoE. And with a lot of these units going to be dying and then coming back and dying and coming back, that's a lot of AoE you can get, which means more harvest triggers as backliners get killed. Looking at secondary clans, with Hellhorned, it's all about the imps, man. Imps are amazing in this deck. They get the summon triggers. They're even better than most tomb units as well in a lot of ways, because you get all of the summon triggers. And on top of that, you have a unit that dies and can get reformed over and over and over again. Transcendent is especially powerful. One thing you have to worry about with Transcendent is you don't typically want to have Welder Helpers, because Welder Helpers aren't dying as easily. The exception is if you have important work. If you have important work on holdover, then you can get a Welder Helper, because you can Welder Help it before the enemy's attack and play something else in front afterward. But outside of that, Fledgling Imps, Molting Imps are really good. If you have any priority consume spells, you can do Impish Scholar. But yeah, Transcendent becomes really, really powerful in a deck like this where you have any imps at all. And then spells, Important Work, Imp in a Box. Both of those are going to be really good. Branding Right is really good at scaling up your Rector Flicker. It's also good at killing backliners to get harvest triggers. Vent is all about that AoE. So yeah, get plus magic power on it, play it for 0, profit. And then in terms of artifacts, Impsicle, so more imps, the better, and Ashes of the Fallen. If you can get double triggers on any of your summon triggers, you're going to be really happy. For Awoken, what you really want is something that can do a lot of damage and especially can damage the back line. So priorities for me are Animus of Will and Shattered Shell. Both of them are pretty good at getting a lot of damage very quickly. As well, Vine Mother tends to be really good in decks like this. You can put Vine Mother up at the top. Just get stings. Stings then help you to draw into your priority spells. It also helps you to kill off units on that bottom floor where Rector Flicker is. In terms of other spells, Glimmer tends to be really good, especially if you can upgrade it. Razor Sharp Edge tends to be really, really good as well. It's good for a lot of reasons. It can help you kill backliners. You can use it as a backline access. It's good with your Animus of Will. It's good with your other harvest units. It's also a way to kill off your own units. So there's a lot of uses for Razor Sharp Edge that can be exploited with a build like this. And then Spreading Spores tends to be pretty good. Any type of spikes can be another way to get the harvest triggers. So if you can't get a lot of units consistently dying, you can do something like a Spreading Spores build, or even a Cycle of Life build, where you get tons of spikes on your Rector Flicker, and he's killing the back line with all the spikes, and that allows him to get really thick. In terms of artifacts, again, Emblem of Exiles. The thing with Emblem of Exiles is you want to make sure that your Rector Flicker is the one in the front at the end of the turn. But outside of that, it's pretty easy to take advantage of all that extra health. And then Thorn Fruit, again, getting you extra damage, making it more likely you can get those harvest triggers on the bottom floor or on the floor with your Rector Flicker, as well as the draw. And the draw is always going to be good. Stygian Guard. Here it's all about accessing that back line. So Cold Celia, Icy Celophyte, Siren of the Sea as a kind of substitute. But yeah, Sweep. Sweep is the name of the game here. So you want to get sweep units. Ideally, you get something like either quick or just extra damage and multi-strike. And yeah, the nice thing is that Cold Celia as well applies the Frostbite on that floor, on that combat. So they're going to die before they move up. In terms of priority spells, again, it's all about AoE or heavy burst. So Ancient Synergy, Titan's Tooth, Ice Tornado, Ice Storm, anything that you can do to kill backliners or frontliners, allowing for more harvest triggers. In terms of artifacts, if you get a Cold Celia or if you get any other major Frostbite, you want Cuddlebeard. Cuddlebeard also helps a lot with relentless combat. So if you have Cold Celia, you have your Rector Flicker in front, and then you have your relentless combat. She'll start stacking up lots and lots and lots of Frostbite, making it much easier to kill bosses. And then Titan's Claws. If you have any high cost spells, getting them to be permafrost means that they'll be free after being held over or after being frozen for one turn. And that tends to be pretty good. For Umbra, you can, this is actually kind of a weird build, but it does work. You can put a morsel maker in front, and then every turn it generates 2 morsels, which are your blockers, giving you harvest stacks. That actually works pretty well. I've done that with a few different setups. Outside of that, having a separate Gorge floor is pretty good, and then of course having a Shadow Siege, if you can manage it, it's also pretty good. Gorge in general is not as good in harvest builds, but it's okay. You can make it work. But I really like using the Morsel Master, Morsel Maker to generate morsels, which then die, giving you harvest triggers. In terms of priority spells, Cannibalize is amazing because Cannibalize gives you chump blockers and kills off a unit. So you can play a morsel, cannibalize that morsel, get a harvest stack, then play more morsels as chump blockers, which then give you even more harvests. So yeah, Cannibalize is amazing. It's also really good for killing off things like if you end up getting something like a Bounty Stalker, or if you get a what else? Legion of Wax that you want to kill off. That's probably not the best example. More like Bounty Stalker or Tomb units that are going to survive. You can Furnace Tap them. There's not Furnace Tap. You can Cannibalize them. After Cannibalize, Furnace Tap's always going to be good. Trample Stones, Umbra Stone is also going to be really good to get Trample. Anything that can make it more consistent, give you more damage, and being able to give access to the backline is going to help. Artifacts, Mind Jacks, again, getting more space means more units to chump block, means more harvest stacks. So yeah, Mind Jacks is going to be the best one. Outside of that, Abandoned Untumbra tends to be pretty good. You're not really getting morsels to Gorge. You're getting morsels specifically to harvest. So Abandoned Untumbra is pretty good because you get pretty crappy morsels, but you're always going to get them, and then you can immediately play them as chump blockers. All right. Oh, wait. Maybe a quick summary. So summary here is Accumulator's all about sweep, because you want to kill backliners to get more harvest triggers, AoE spells, and chump blockers. So whatever you can do to get a good mix of chump blockers and AoE is going to help you out a lot. It's not typically that difficult to get damage to kill frontliners or damage to kill the bosses. It's really about making sure backliners are not getting to the pyre. And that's all then dealt with by AoE or sweep. Finally, last of all of the upgrade paths for the original champions, we have Dark Calling Rector Flicker. Dark Calling is a 15 damage, 15 health unit that has Resolve, reform 2 random units, and apply an additional +5 damage. At rank 2, the Resolve trigger doubles to add +10 damage, and he gets double health, double damage. At rank 3, he gets another 20 damage and 20 health, and he gets an additional 5 damage on reform. So what are his strengths? He has high damage scaling for support units via his Resolve trigger. So if you have units that take advantage of increased damage, things like drafts, multi-striking units, they're going to scale immensely well with the Resolve triggers. As well, it has pretty good burnout and health scaling for support units as well. So if you have, like, again, drafts, they'll die, come back, then they'll have an extra burnout, and every time they die, they keep coming back with more and more burnout. It's also really good with any other kind of units that you want to kill off and bring back repeatedly throughout a run, something like a Bounty Stalker, for example. Weak is it's pretty low damage and health at rank 1 and 2, so it's definitely not going to be your carry unit. There's no innate backline access, there's no innate damage scaling on himself, and there's no innate sustain. So it's really not about him. It's not about you, Rector Flicker. It's about the units that he's supporting. Opportunities, you want you want multi-strike units, you want sweep units, you want burnout units. All of them will get the most benefit out of the Resolve triggers. And then for him, even though he doesn't have the highest health and damage, it's still going to be probably lifesteal over regen and then regen over damage shield and armor, although damage shield can be pretty good. I would say they're all more or less equal, with lifesteal a little bit better because he has exactly the same amount of damage as he has health, and especially at rank 3, that's going to heal him the most. When it comes to threats, his resolve trigger is randomized, so even if you have the right units, if you have a whole bunch of chump blockers and they keep getting reformed, you're going to have a sad time. As well, the timing of unit deaths becomes very important. The unit has to die before the resolve trigger. So that means it has to die either on the floor or higher than the floor of Rector Flicker. And that can be kind of tricky because that means you're putting Rector Flicker on the bottom, which puts him in danger. So a lot of people, especially when they first start playing this, they put Rector Flicker on the top and wonder why they're not getting any units back. It's because it has to happen. They have to die before the floor where Rector Flicker is doing his resolve trigger. Also important to note is the resolve trigger does not go off if if Rector Flicker is dazed. So playing him on the top floor also means that even if something dies on the top floor, he won't have his resolve trigger because he'll be stunned. Another major threat is Seraph the Patient's rally trigger. If you're playing a lot of reformed units, that's a lot of rally triggers, and that can become really dangerous. So you need to think about how to place units so that you're not getting rally triggers, but still keeping especially Rector Flicker safe. Moving into tactical tips. So again, he is a low stat support unit whose role is to buff other units by reforming them. And again, just consider where you want to play him. I typically play him on the first floor or the middle floor so that we can get the most value out of his resolve trigger. Pretty decent setup can be you put Rector Flicker in the back with several scaling chump units in front. So you get something like drafts, or you get dregs, or even bounty stalker, or whatever. You put them up front, they die, and you keep reforming them up front until finally the relentless combat, where then you switch it up. You put Rector Flicker in the front, and you put your now scaled up units in the back. Just be cautious about, again, how many units you have in your consume pool, because the reform is random. You can't guarantee it's going to hit the units that you want. Units with multi-strike and sweep are going to be the best ones for reforming. Other ones as well you can think about is things with natural tags. So natural spikes, natural extinguish. That's going to be also really good for reform. In terms of deck building, priority units, number 1, Bounty Stalker. Bounty Stalker builds with Dark Calling are pretty good because you already have innate ways to bring Bounty Stalker back, and that's always the main problem. Is it's easy to kill him off, it's harder to bring him back. But if you have guaranteed reform triggers, it becomes much easier. Legion of Wax is also a really, really good reform target, especially if you can have him reformed 2 or 3 times. That is a lot of thick boys to get through during relentless combat. So I really have been growing more and more fond of these Legion of Wax Dark Calling builds, which I find to be quite strong. Outside of that, it's mostly your standard burnout units, Lady of the House, drafts, Paraffin Enforcers. They're all going to take benefit. And Paraffin Enforcer especially, you can have him die and then bring him back, have him die a few times, and then during relentless combat, you put him in the back and he'll scale his own damage throughout the entire relentless fight, which tends to be pretty good. And then, of course, Tomb units are also pretty good. Comes to spells, Intent on Death. You've got Bounty Stalker, you've got Legion of Wax, you've got Molten Encasement, you've got Entombed Explosive. All of those are going to love Intent on Death. Scale them up insanely well. Wicklash is also very good. It's very good as a way to prepare units for dying and then coming back with extra stats. It's really good on Legion of Wax. It's pretty good on Bounty Stalker. It's really, really good on Paraffin Enforcer. So it just fits this kind of overall reform burnout style. Crushing Demise can be really good because it guarantees that unit will get into the consume pool. So if you're Crushing Demise a unit, it will be one that could be reformed. Wickless Recruitment is a way to reform units and then remove the burnout from them, so there's less risk that they die to burnout once they're reformed. So you can get Permafrost on it, wait until the relentless fight, put the unit in the back, use Wickless Recruitment to remove the burnout. It's got all those stats that it gained from getting reformed by Rector Flicker, and then do all that damage during the relentless combat. Subsuming Blade also, for the same reason as Crushing Demise, you're killing off your own units, you're bringing them back, and you can get a lot of value out of killing them, reforming, killing them, reforming. Subsuming Blade is also pretty good at enemies as well, right? You can also use it to kill off enemies, but I primarily am using it for killing off my own units. And last, Sacrificial Resurrection. Sacrificial Resurrection has dual purpose. One, gets rid of garbage so you can get garbage out of your deck, and 2, it gives you a big old fat draft to then reform and reform and reform. So it's primarily why I use it, is to with this particular build. With other builds, it can be really good as a way to clean out your deck. But in this build, I use it specifically to get big drafts that then can get reformed and get really, really strong. In terms of priority artifacts, Waxer Snuffer, again, similar with Intent on Death. You have a lot of Extinguish. Take advantage of that Extinguish with a Waxer Snuffer. Resin Block, it's going to add an additional 10 damage, so it's going to be plus 15, plus 20, plus 25 damage per reform. That's going to be absolutely nuts on almost every unit you have. Combustible Wax to make sure that your units, when they're reformed, have plenty of time to do their damage. And Fade's First Blade, with so many units that are going to have burnout from reforming, Fade's First Blade is going to make them all that much stronger. Getting into secondary clans, starting with Hellhorn, all about them imps. Imps are also fantastic in this build. They can get really strong, and then you can put them behind your Rector Flicker at the end, and they'll actually be legitimately strong for relentless combat. And they don't take up much space. You can fit a lot of them. As well, they're summon triggers, right? So you can get a lot of armor, a lot of rage, a lot of stats onto your Rector Flicker or other units, and then keep reforming and reforming and reforming. And since you have a lot of imps, then Important Work, Impressive becomes really good. Inferno. So this is actually cool. You can Inferno an entire floor and then bring it all back. So if you have like a second floor with a ton of units that are just there to be reformed, you can Inferno them. It's also a great way to kill Bounty Stalker, is to Inferno Bounty Stalker and any other units on that floor. Can be a really solid way of guaranteeing that you have units to reform every turn, and then vent for that AoE. AoE is typically a problem in general with Melting Remnant, so you try to get that AoE out of the secondary clan. Priority artifacts, as you have a lot of imps, hopefully Ashes of the Fallen becomes quite good. Queen's Tail also becomes quite good. I mean, if you don't have any imps at all, you can always go with demons, but demons aren't great reform targets. The only one that I would say is pretty good is Railbeater, because Railbeater will get that armor back every time it's reformed. But outside of that, they just aren't very good. They don't have a lot of innate stuff, and they rely on rage, so you don't want them dying all the time. Getting into Awoken, priority units, we talked about Animus of Will already as a reform target. She's an excellent reform target by your Rector Flicker. Plus 15 damage goes a long way when you have ×3 strikes. Shattered Shell, also for the same reason. Get that Shattered Shell really nice and thick, and it's going to kill units and do a lot of good for you. Animus of Speed is also a decent one. It's not as good as the others, but still in a pinch, Animus of Speed can be really valuable. When you have units like this, if you're worried about them not dying, the easiest way to get around that is by giving them Burnout as an upgrade stone. Then you can guarantee it'll come back, and it'll even start scaling Burnout from the beginning. In terms of spells, Razor Sharp Edge, you have a lot of units that are going to get reformed. Razor Sharp Edge is great for them because it's permanent, and as well, they don't really need that much health. You're typically going to be tanking with other units more likely, or just building them up with all of the reforms. And then you can have plenty of health to work with for Razor Sharp Edge. Root Seeds as well, same thing. It's permanent, even through reforms. Steel Enhancer for the same reason. So it's really just stat enhancements. You can also put Glimmer in there. Glimmer's pretty good if you don't have any other AoE. But hopefully you get something like a sweep unit or an Animus of Will that can clear the back line pretty well. In terms of artifacts, again, Emblem of Exiles, those stats come and they stay. So yeah, even on reform, if your units are dying, they still keep all that health. So Emblem of Exiles is still the priority, and then Thorn Fruit for extra damage and draw. Kind of a standard theme here with Awoken. Those two artifacts are the only ones that are just consistently good across all builds. For Stygian Guard, Titan Sentry tends to be a pretty good reform target. Gives him more health, gives him some damage, and he dies pretty easily. He doesn't have that much health. So then reforming him over and over again, he can become quite strong. Siren of the Sea is also a pretty good reform target because she keeps all the stats she gets from incanting. Then she dies, you bring her back. She dies, you bring her back. She can get really, really, really strong. And then Cold Celia just for the AoE. Again, AoE being the biggest weakness in Melting Remnant. So then spells fits in there as well. Titan's Tooth, Ice Tornado, Ice Storm. Flash Freeze for targeted damage. It's also quite good for killing off your own units, in case you're having issues killing them and then being able to reform them. And then in terms of artifacts, Icicle Fracture tends to be pretty good, mainly so that you can keep spells that you want for the time that you want them, or keep units when you want for the time that you want them. So what can often happen in builds like this is like you have a unit, it's reformed, but it's not really a good time to play it because it's maybe a rest in between, and you don't want to play it now because it's got 3 burnout, and you don't want to waste a burnout. So then Icicle Fracture allows you to keep that unit in your hand for an extra turn and then play it on the next turn. And then if you have Icicle Fracture or have any permafrost at all, then Titan's Claws is going to be really, really valuable. And finally, Umbra. Priority unit here, Overgorger. Overgorger's really nice in this build. One, he's going to get real thick. You put him on the top floor, you gorge him like crazy, then you do all your rest of your stuff. But then even if he dies, it's fine. You reform him. He keeps all those stats, and you can profit. So especially during the especially during the Ring 6 and Ring 8, you want Overgorger as your main carry, and you don't have to worry so much about gorging during those fights. Just try to take advantage of the damage. Outside of that, Shadow Eater for AoE, Shadow Siege if you can play it. Flicker's Liquor makes that much easier, by the way. And I don't think I mentioned this before, but that's true of any Melting Remnant Umbra combination, is that Flicker's Liquor is going to always be good just because it gets Shadow Siege to be free occasionally. In terms of spells, Cannibalize, for the same reason we talked about with Accumulator. You can kill a unit and then make sure that it's going to reform. You just got to be careful about Morsels, because Morsels can get reformed if they die. So then instead you want to cannibalize other units that you want to reform and make sure you're gorging those morsels. Blazing Bolts tends to be pretty good. Mind Collapse tends to be pretty good for backline access. You can also think about Excavation Eruption is also a good way to kill backliners. And apart from that, you don't really want to do Ember Drain package because most of your units are dying and then getting reformed, so they would lose all those buffs anyway. Then Priority Artifacts, Mind Jacks still give you more space, and Refined Void. The nice thing about Refined Void as well is that your units, when they're reformed, will come back with Lifesteal. So then they come back and already have some innate sustain. In general, Dark Calling's all about getting a good unit to reform, or several good units to reform, having a consistent way to make sure that they're dying and reforming, and then taking advantage as much as you can with stat buffs or AoE. That's the secondary part. So getting a lot of stat buffs, getting a lot of AoE is going to help you out. With that, we're on to the final flex and final rankings of Rector Flicker. So in terms of flex, it's very similar to Penumbra. They all tend to like to stick to their own path all the way through, because that switch from rank 2 to 3 for Burn Bright, that's a huge stat increase. For Accumulator, that's a huge harvest stack increase. For Dark Calling, you may consider flexing one of the others, but honestly, the rank 1s of both are so bad, it's almost not worth it. Especially, let me say, you might flex Accumulator rank 1 into a Burn or into a Dark Calling, but honestly, it's not as worth as just getting the extra 5 damage on Reform and the extra stats. He goes from 30 to 50 health. That tends to be pretty good. So I would say stick with the path all the way through. In terms of my personal rankings, I think Accumulator is by far the easiest to play. Certainly isn't going to be as easy early game as Burn Bright, but man, late game, Accumulator just gets insane. It's hard to lose runs with Accumulator if you have consistent units that are going to die up front. On your side, not even on the enemy side, but just on your side. If you have consistent units that are going to die from your team, it's pretty hard to lose. After that, Burn Bright is pretty good because all you need to do is get a way to reform or extend his burnout, and he's going to be pretty strong through most of the run. Dark Calling tends to be the most difficult because it's entirely reliant on your secondary units, and if you don't get good ones, it's going to be tough to scale. And with that, we're done. We have finished the entire OG guide. So if you like this video, please subscribe. If you've subscribed already and want to see more of this kind of content, let me know in the comments. And we just have 2 more parts. So we're going to do the Exiled Champions next, starting with Shardtail Queen and the Wildington build upgrade paths. And with that, again, hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.